The air was thick with the scent of ancient paper and dust, a quiet testament to the passage of time. Armin's hands trembled as he flipped through the brittle pages of the manuscript that had consumed his thoughts for weeks. The tiny library in Chiras was a forgotten corner of the world, its stone walls sheltering artifacts that most of humanity had long abandoned. But in this solitude, something extraordinary was waiting. It started with an ordinary-looking box, tucked away in a corner that seemed almost intentionally obscured. The librarian had mentioned it in passing, her voice betraying no significance, some old things from the pre-Zoroastrian days. Nothing much. But the moment Armin opened it, he felt an inexplicable pull, as though the box itself was aware of its importance. Inside were scrolls wrapped in tattered silk. The fabric had faded, and its patterns were lost to decay, but the aura it carried felt alive. Armin unrolled the first scroll with the care of someone touching a relic that might crumble at the slightest provocation. The writing was in an ancient script, but what caught his attention were the symbols, so vivid, so deliberate. They depicted figures with wings of fire, eyes that seemed to pierce through eternity, and halos of celestial light. This wasn't Zoroastrianism. This was something older, something raw and untamed. He took a breath, steadying himself, and began to translate. The words spoke of gods who had ruled before Ahura Mazda's light became dominant. Gods of passion and rage, of serenity and chaos. They were not benevolent nor malevolent. They simply were. And now, they were forgotten, their names erased from the tongues of men. The scrolls called them the first ones. Each god had a name, but as Armin whispered them aloud, the air seemed to shift. A cold draft brushed his cheek, though the room was sealed. Mitra, he read softly, feeling a surge of strength pulse through his chest. Anahita, he murmured, his lips tingling with an unfamiliar sweetness. And then, Armin, a name that sent a shiver down his spine. He paused. The last name lingered in the room, heavy and unwelcome. His mind raced. These were not the sanitized figures of modern faith, these were beings of unimaginable complexity, beings who could not be controlled or contained. He pressed on, hungry for answers, his hands gripping the fragile parchment as if it could vanish if he let go. Hours passed unnoticed. The dim light of the library shifted, casting long shadows across the floor. Armin's back ached, but he barely noticed. The scrolls spoke of wars that tore apart heavens, of covenants sealed in blood, of a time when the gods walked among mortals and left their marks on the earth. Rivers carved by Anahita's tears. Mountains raised in anger by Vragna. It was a world that felt achingly real, and yet it was lost. A particularly delicate scroll caught his eye. Its ink was darker, the strokes sharper, almost violent. As he read, his heart began to race. This was no ordinary myth, this was a warning. It spoke of a betrayal, a moment when humanity had turned its back on the first ones, choosing the singular light of Ahura Mazda over the wild, chaotic beauty of the pantheon. The gods had not vanished willingly, they had been exiled. Their temples were destroyed, their worshippers silenced. But the words didn't end there. The scroll hinted at something terrifying, the first ones were waiting. Their power had not waned, only gone unnoticed. The balance of the world was fragile, and if the gods returned, they would do so with wrath. Armin rubbed his temples, trying to process the enormity of what he was reading. He looked around the room as if expecting someone, or something, to appear. The quiet was oppressive now, the stillness too sharp. He shook his head, dismissing the thought, but the sensation of being watched lingered. He lit a small lamp to continue, its flickering light casting eerie shapes across the walls. His fingers brushed against another scroll, smaller than the others. Its wax seal bore a symbol he couldn't recognize, a circle intersected by jagged lines. He hesitated, then broke the seal. The parchment was covered in diagrams and annotations. At the center of it all was a figure, taller and grander than the rest. No name was given, only a title, the Forgotten One. The text described a god who had been erased even from the pantheon's own stories. This being, the scroll claimed, was the key to understanding it all. A single phrase was repeated at the bottom, written in a language so old that even Armin struggled to make sense of it. Translating it word by word, he pieced together its meaning. When the stars align, the silent will speak. Armin leaned back in his chair, his head spinning. His life had been dedicated to uncovering the past, but this felt different. This wasn't history, it was alive. He couldn't shake the feeling that the gods were not content to remain in scrolls and legends. His breath quickened as he considered what it would mean if the scrolls were right. If these beings still had power, then their erasure was not just a historical footnote, it was a dangerous act of defiance. The lamp flickered, and a chill ran through the room. Armin stood up abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. The air felt heavy, and for a moment, he thought he heard a faint whisper. It wasn't words, just a sound, soft, insistent, and impossibly distant. He looked down at the scroll in his hands. The ink seemed darker now, as if the words were deepening before his eyes. He blinked, trying to steady himself, but the feeling wouldn't go away. Something was stirring, and for the first time in his career, Armin wasn't sure if he wanted to know what it was. Before light, before time, before even the whisper of existence, there was chaos. A vast, formless void stretched endlessly, neither dark nor bright, neither alive nor lifeless. It was a silence so profound that it seemed to hum with a tension too immense to comprehend, as if all that would ever be was waiting to erupt into being. And then it did. From this void, a single ripple coursed outward, breaking the stillness. It was not sound, nor light, but something primal, something unstoppable. The ripple expanded, twisting and turning, colliding with itself in a cacophony of creation. This was the first breath of the cosmos, raw and untamed, born not from order but from an explosion of unrestrained possibility. From the chaos emerged a seed, glowing with an intensity that no mortal eyes could endure. It floated, pulsating with life yet unshaped, until it split apart, birthing twin forces that would shape all that followed. One was Ahura Mazda, the wise lord, a radiant being whose presence was a symphony of light, truth, and creation. His very essence seemed to hum with harmony, his gaze carrying the promise of life and balance. But his birth was not solitary, for from the same seed came Ingramenu, the destructive spirit, a shadow that moved with equal power but opposite intent. Ingramenu was the embodiment of chaos, of decay, of all things that sought to unmake what had been made. The two gazed at each other, their forms flickering with the power of the cosmos. There was no hatred, no malice, only inevitability. They were not enemies, they were opposites, bound together in an eternal dance. Between them, the void began to shift. Ahura Mazda stretched his hand, and from his touch sprang light, warm and nurturing, spreading across the emptiness. Ingramenu followed, and where his fingers grazed, the light splintered, giving birth to shadow. Together, they painted the first strokes of existence, each creation balanced by its counterpart. The heavens were born, a vast dome of shimmering stars. Each star was a thought, a spark from Ahura Mazda's mind, a promise of worlds yet to come. But even as they flickered into being, Ingramenu breathed his own essence into the void, and darkness gathered between the stars, shaping the spaces where fear and doubt would dwell. Their creations were not alone. From the interplay of light and shadow, others emerged, beings of incredible power and purpose, each reflecting the duality of their makers. The first was Mitra, the god of covenants, whose light was sharp and piercing, yet unwavering in its truth. Following him was Anahita, whose waters flowed with purity and nourishment but also carried the fury of unrelenting tides. The world itself was born in a clash of wills. Ahura Mazda envisioned a place of order, a sanctuary where life could thrive. He sculpted the earth from stardust, molding it with care, creating mountains that touched the skies and valleys that cradled rivers. But as soon as his hands left the earth, Ingramenu struck, tearing at its perfection. He split the mountains into jagged peaks, churned the rivers into torrents, and filled the valleys with shadow. Life began as a fragile whisper. Ahura Mazda planted seeds of existence, small and delicate, but Ingramenu twisted their forms, introducing hunger, decay, and the endless cycle of struggle. Plants grew but were not immune to drought, animals roamed but were haunted by predators. The gods watched as this new world teetered between beauty and destruction, between hope and despair. It was not what Ahura Mazda had envisioned, yet it was alive, vibrant in its imperfection. In the midst of this chaos, Ahura Mazda took a final step. He fashioned humanity from clay, shaping them with hands that trembled not from fear but from the weight of responsibility. Humans were unlike anything that had come before. They were fragile, mortal, and small. Yet within them, he placed a spark of his own light, a fragment of divine wisdom. Ungramenu laughed at this creation, his voice like the crack of thunder. "They will falter," he said, his shadow stretching over the first humans. "They will break, just as all things do." But Ahura Mazda smiled. "And yet they will rise." The humans opened their eyes to a world brimming with wonder and danger. The gods watched from afar, their influence shaping the mortal realm in subtle, often unseen ways. Mitra whispered truth into the hearts of the just, while Anahita's waters nourished crops and quenched thirsts. Ungramenu, too, made his mark, sowing discord and fear, testing the strength of humanity's resolve. As the first mortals grew and learned, they began to tell stories of the gods who shaped their world. They built altars and lit fires, their prayers rising into the heavens. But even in their devotion, they carried the duality of their creators. For every hymn of gratitude, there was a cry of despair. For every act of kindness, there was one of cruelty. The gods did not intervene directly, for this was the nature of the world they had birthed, a place where light and shadow, creation and destruction, could never exist without the other. But there was a warning whispered through the winds, carried in the rustling of leaves and the murmurs of streams. The balance was delicate, and though Ahura Mazda and Ungramenu were bound together, their creations were not immune to change. If one force grew too strong, the other would not hesitate to act. The world, vibrant and alive, was a battleground in waiting, its fate resting in the hands of those fragile beings who bore the spark of divinity. The chaos from which everything was born had not vanished, it lingered, waiting for its moment to rise again. And in the stillness between breaths, the gods watched, their hearts heavy with both pride and apprehension. Creation was not a triumph, it was a gamble, and the stakes were beyond comprehension. The cosmos was silent, waiting, as if it knew something monumental was about to unfold. There was no sound, no light, only the weight of potential. Then, like the first crack of thunder before a storm, two presences emerged from the void, neither born nor created but always existing, waiting for the moment to rise. Ahura Mazda was the first to reveal himself. His form radiated warmth, his light not harsh but soothing, wrapping everything it touched in a gentle embrace. He carried a calm certainty, an unshakable resolve to bring harmony to the chaos. His voice, if it could be called that, resonated like 1,000 soft whispers, weaving a tapestry of order across the endless void. But light cannot exist without shadow. From the same boundless source came Ungramenu. His arrival was not an explosion but a quiet, creeping darkness, filling the spaces the light could not reach. His presence was cold and sharp, like a blade pressing against your skin, a reminder of everything that could go wrong. Where Ahura Mazda brought peace, Ungramenu was the chaos that disrupted it. They were opposites, yet bound together like two halves of a single coin. They faced each other in the infinite expanse, not as adversaries, not yet, but as forces that could not coexist without tension. Ahura Mazda reached out, his essence spilling into the void, crafting shapes, patterns, and possibilities. He drew lines where there were none, filled the emptiness with stars, and created the first gentle ripple of time. Ungramenu watched, his form like a shadow cast by an unseen flame. His presence moved, slow and deliberate, around the edges of Ahura Mazda's creation. He did not lash out immediately. He steadied, waiting for the right moment, until the first spark of perfection appeared. And then he struck. His touch was chaos incarnate, twisting and breaking what had been pure. He shattered the stillness of Ahura Mazda's lines, bent them into jagged edges, turned light into shadow, and harmony into discord. But this wasn't destruction for the sake of it. No, Ungramenu didn't merely unmake, he reshaped. He added imbalance, imperfection, ensuring that nothing could exist without struggle. Ahura Mazda pulled back, his light brightening as if to shield his work. "Why do you destroy?" his voice asked, carrying not anger but sadness. Ungramenu's response was a low hum, cold and unyielding. "I do not destroy. I test. I reveal the weakness in your creation. Without me, it would crumble at the slightest touch." Their words were not arguments but truths. Neither could deny the other's nature. For every star Ahura Mazda placed in the sky, Ungramenu sent a shadow to stretch between them. For every act of beauty, he planted the seed of its opposite. Ahura Mazda created the earth, strong and fertile, and Ungramenu carved it with chasms, splitting it into jagged lands that bore both wonder and peril. And so the dance began. Where one brought life, the other brought the inevitability of death. Where one gave hope, the other sowed doubt. They moved not as enemies but as forces locked in a balance that neither could escape. Yet, even balance comes with pain. When Ahura Mazda created humans, shaping them with care and placing within them the spark of wisdom, Ungramenu's laughter echoed like thunder. "They are fragile," he said, circling the first mortals like a predator. "They will crumble under the weight of your expectations." But Ahura Mazda was steadfast. "They are strong," he replied, his light enveloping the humans. "They will endure because they choose to." And so began their war, not fought with weapons, but with influence. Ahura Mazda whispered truth and compassion into the hearts of mortals, showing them the path of righteousness. Ungramenu countered with fear and hatred, stoking the fires of greed, anger, and despair. It was not a battle with a beginning or end, it was eternal, stretching across the ages, shaping every decision, every conflict, every triumph, and every failure. There were moments when Ungramenu seemed to win. He would send storms to ravage the lands, disease to break the spirit, and despair to poison the mind. Mortals, frail and fleeting, often succumbed, their hearts turning away from the light. But even in the darkest moments, Ahura Mazda's spark endured. A small act of kindness, a single gesture of courage, a fleeting moment of hope, these were the victories that kept his presence alive. Ungramenu did not falter. For every act of goodness, he created a consequence. When a mortal built a home, he brought the winds to threaten it. When a leader sought peace, he whispered distrust into their ear. Yet, he was not purely malice. To him, his role was necessary. Without suffering, he believed, there could be no growth. Without fear, there could be no courage. Without darkness, the light would mean nothing. The war spilled into the heavens. The gods themselves, children of these twin powers, were caught in the eternal conflict. Mitra, Anahita, Tiria, and Vragna, all of them bore the marks of their creators. They fought for the balance, each in their own way, but none could tip the scales entirely. Mortals told stories of the twin powers, stories that shifted with each generation. To some, Ahura Mazda was the benevolent creator, and Ungramenu the wicked destroyer. To others, Ungramenu was the truth-teller, exposing the flaws in a world that pretended to be perfect. But no story could capture the full weight of what they were, two forces that shaped every breath, every heartbeat, every choice. Their battle wasn't loud. It wasn't filled with thunder or fire. It was subtle, woven into the fabric of existence itself. When a child cried out in the night, it was Ungramenu who filled their dreams with terror and Ahura Mazda who gave them the strength to face it. When a farmer planted seeds, it was Ahura Mazda who made them grow and Ungramenu who sent drought to test their resolve. Neither could win. That was the truth of their existence. For if Ahura Mazda ever banished the darkness completely, the light would lose its meaning. And if Ungramenu ever smothered the light, the chaos would consume even himself. There were two sides of a coin, spinning endlessly through the universe, shaping everything that was and ever would be. And so, the battle continued, not with swords or flames, but with whispers in the wind, shadows in the corners of a room, and the quiet resilience of those who carried their sparks. The war was not theirs alone, it was ours too, etched into the choices we make, the lives we live, and the stories we tell. The sun blazed over the mountains, its rays casting long shadows across the earth. The world was still, the kind of stillness that only comes before something immense, something destined. Then, as though summoned by the very heartbeat of the land, a figure appeared on the horizon. He stood tall and unyielding, his presence both calm and powerful, like the quiet before a storm. Mitra, the god of light, truth, and covenants, had arrived. From the beginning, he was different. Where other gods were born of chaos, of creation or destruction, Mitra was born from the essence of balance, an embodiment of all that was sacred, all that was pure. His first breath was the breath of truth, the kind that cut through lies and deceit like a blade through the fog. He was the protector of promises, the guardian of what was sworn. The first time humans called upon his name was not in battle, nor in fear, but in hope. In a time when words could be twisted and oaths easily broken, the people turned to Mitra for protection. The earth had given them so much, but they had forgotten how to honor what was given. Trust was a fragile thing, so easily shattered by betrayal. Mitra stood as a bridge between gods and men, his purpose clear. His eyes were like the morning sun, bright, unblinking, never faltering. When he spoke, it was not with the arrogance of a ruler, but with the steady wisdom of one who understood the weight of a promise. It was said that Mitra could hear the smallest of whispers, the slightest tremor in a voice that betrayed dishonesty. He knew when hearts faltered, when words were used to mask truth. And he also knew the power of a promise, the sacred trust placed between souls. To Mitra, an oath was not just a word, it was a living bond, stronger than steel and harder than stone. One day, a group of farmers stood before him, each one kneeling with trembling hands, their voices faltering as they spoke. They had come together, united by a common cause, to swear an oath to their community, to work for the betterment of the land, to share in the fruits of their labor. But they feared their words would be broken, as so many promises had been before. Mitra watched them quietly, his gaze steady and unwavering. He did not speak at first. The stillness grew, stretching between them like an unspoken truth. The farmers looked up, their eyes searching for any sign of judgment, but Mitra only saw them as they truly were, flawed, yes, but earnest in their desire to do right. Finally, he spoke. His voice was soft, yet it carried the weight of 1,000 oaths. "Your words are your bond," he said. "And your bond is sacred. To break it is to break the very fabric of trust that holds the world together. But to honor it, that is to honor the gods themselves." With a single gesture, Mitra extended his hand toward them, and the light that surrounded him seemed to grow brighter, not blinding but warm, like the first rays of dawn. The farmers swore their oath once more, this time with a newfound strength in their hearts. As their words left their mouths, Mitra's light wrapped around them, binding their promises like threads of gold. They knew, without doubt, that their word would hold, because Mitra had witnessed it. Mitra had made it sacred. His role was not one of domination or fear. He did not seek to control the hearts of men. Instead, he stood as a reminder that truth was sacred, that promises were not to be made lightly. In the heat of conflict, when anger clouded judgment and distrust ran rampant, it was Mitra who reminded them of the power of their word and of the consequences of breaking it. It was said that Mitra's gaze could pierce the deepest lies, and that nothing could hide from his light. He had the power to strike down those who broke their oaths, but his justice was not cruel. It was precise. Those who betrayed their word were left to face the consequences of their own actions, stripped of the shield of deception. For Mitra knew that no punishment could be more severe than the weight of a shattered trust. But it was not only the darkness that Mitra fought against. He also brought light, healing, and strength to those who held true. When the people called upon him, when their hearts trembled with the fear that they would falter, Mitra would answer. His presence alone was enough to restore hope, to remind them of the power they held within their promises. He became a protector, not through force, but through the sheer power of truth. One of the most sacred of his tasks was to oversee the making of contracts. The deal was not merely a transaction of goods or services, it was a bond between two souls, a union of intention. Mitra, in his infinite wisdom, saw the sacredness of these exchanges. He walked with merchants, with rulers, with farmers, ensuring that their agreements were founded in truth. His symbol, a radiant sun, always rising, always illuminating, became the mark of every contract made in his name. It was said that no agreement sealed under Mitra's gaze could ever be broken, for his light would forever bind it. There came a time when a mighty king sought Mitra's blessing. The king had conquered vast lands, his empire stretching further than any before him. But as the empire grew, so did the whispers of betrayal, of promises broken in the shadows. The king, surrounded by so many who sought to undermine him, feared that the foundation of his kingdom was crumbling beneath him. In desperation, the king turned to Mitra. He swore an oath before him, a vow to rule justly, to uphold the law, to protect the people. As the words left his lips, the light around Mitra grew brighter, and the king knew, in his heart, that his words had been sealed. But Mitra spoke again. The test of your oath will not come in your moments of triumph, but in your moments of doubt. When the temptation to break your word arises, remember me. The king left with Mitra's blessing, but it was not an easy rule he held. His kingdom was tested time and time again by forces both outside and within. There were moments when he could have broken his word, when the temptation to deceive, to break faith, was overwhelming. But each time, Mitra's light shone in his heart, a quiet reminder of the power of his vow. Years passed, and the king's empire remained strong. His people flourished, their trust in him unshaken. And though his rule was fraught with challenges, the foundation of his reign, the trust between him and his people, was built on the eternal light of Mitra, the god who stood as the guardian of oaths, the protector of truth. The first drop of water fell silently, breaking the stillness of the barren land. It touched the parched earth and spread outward, a tiny ripple of life in a world yearning for it. Then came another drop, and another, until they became a stream, weaving its way through the cracked ground, breathing vitality into the desolation. From this stream, a figure began to emerge, a presence as eternal as the water itself. Anahita, the goddess of water and fertility, stood with grace unmatched. Her form shimmered like the surface of a clear lake under the sun, her presence both soothing and awe-inspiring. She was not merely the rain that nourished the fields, she was the essence of every life that sprang from it, the hope that flourished with each harvest, the purity that coursed through the rivers and into the hearts of those who depended on them. Her name was whispered in times of drought, cried out in joy when the rains came, and honored in solemn prayer at the first light of dawn. She was the life-giver, the nurturer, and the one who carried the prayers of those who sought her blessings. Yet, her power was not loud or brash, it was steady, patient, and unyielding, like the rivers she ruled. There is a tale told of a village, forgotten by the rest of the world, where the earth had turned to dust. The rivers had run dry, and the people had lost all hope. They looked to the skies, but no rain came. They turned to their gods, but no answer was heard. Days turned to weeks, weeks to months, and the despair grew heavy, like an invisible shroud over their hearts. One night, as the villagers slept, a child, a girl no older than 10, wandered to the edge of the dried riverbed. She knelt in the silence, her small hands cupping the lifeless soil, her lips moving in a prayer so pure, it seemed the stars themselves paused to listen. She did not ask for wealth or power. She did not beg for her life to be spared. She asked only for water, so her people could live. In the quiet that followed, a soft breeze stirred the girl's hair, carrying with it a faint scent of jasmine and rain. When she opened her eyes, she saw her, Anahita, radiant and kind, her presence as gentle as the first rainfall after a scorching summer. The goddess knelt beside her, her hands reaching out to touch the parched earth. Where her fingers met the ground, water began to flow, clear and sparkling. It rushed forward, filling the empty riverbed, spilling into the fields, and soaking into the earth. The girl stared in wonder as life returned to the land, the barren fields now rich with green, the air filled with the sweet song of birds. The villagers awoke to the sight of their fields alive once more, their spirits renewed. They did not see Anahita, but they felt her in every drop of water, in the scent of the fertile soil, in the joy that surged through their veins as they embraced the promise of another harvest. They knew she had answered their prayers, and they offered her their thanks, not in grand temples but in the simple act of caring for the life she had restored. Anahita was not merely a goddess of water, she was the purity it represented. She was the clear spring that quenched thirst, the cleansing rains that washed away sin, and the sacred rivers that carried prayers to the heavens. To those who sought her, she was a mother, holding them close, nurturing them, reminding them that even in the harshest times, there was hope. But her purity was not fragile. It was fierce. She was the protector of those who could not protect themselves, the voice of the voiceless. When the unjust sought to pollute her waters or take more than they were given, Anahita's wrath was like the flood, unstoppable and devastating. She was kind, but she was not weak. Her justice was as swift as it was righteous. There was a time when a great ruler sought to control the rivers that flowed through his lands. He built dams and diverted streams, hoarding the waters for his own gain while leaving the villages downstream to wither and die. The people cried out to Anahita, their voices carried by the winds to her sacred waters. One night, as the ruler slept, the rivers rose without warning. The dams cracked and crumbled under the weight of her fury, and the waters surged through the lands, washing away the greed and corruption. When the sun rose, the ruler's palace was gone, swallowed by the flood, but the villages downstream stood untouched, their fields brimming with water. The people knew who had answered their cries, and they honored her with offerings of the first fruits of their harvest. Anahita's waters were life, but they were also memory. They carried the stories of the world, the whispers of ancient times, the dreams of those who sought solace in her presence. Her rivers were not just streams of water, they were the veins of the earth, connecting all who walked upon it, reminding them that they were part of something greater. And her essence was a paradox. She was soft yet unyielding, nurturing yet powerful, forgiving yet just. She was the embodiment of life itself, unpredictable and ever-changing, yet steady in its purpose. To honor her was to honor the cycles of nature, the purity of intention, the sacredness of giving without expecting in return. When her name was spoken, it was with reverence, not out of fear but out of love. Her presence was felt in the first rains of spring, in the gentle streams that whispered through the forests, and the laughter of children playing in the riverbanks. She was everywhere and everything, the quiet force that sustained the world even when it seemed to fall apart. And so, Anahita remained, a beacon of hope, a protector of purity, the mother who never turned away her children. Her waters flowed endlessly, carrying with them not only the promise of life, but the reminder that even in the harshest droughts, the rains would come again. The river was calm, its surface gleaming like molten silver under the moonlight. There was a stillness in the air, a quiet that seemed unnatural, as if the world held its breath. Then, without warning, the water rippled. A faint light began to glow beneath the surface, growing brighter with each passing moment. It wasn't the light of the moon or the stars. It was something ancient, something alive. The glow turned into a flame, a fire that burned within the waters yet did not consume them. From the heart of the river, a figure rose. His form was radiant, his presence fierce and commanding. This was Apam Napad, the child of the waters, the flame that lived within the depths. He was a being of paradoxes, fire within water, light within darkness, power within serenity. He was both the stillness of the river and the unrelenting force of the torrent. Long before men understood the ways of the world, they knew of him. They spoke his name in hushed tones, their voices tinged with awe and fear. Apam Napad was not a gentle god. He was raw energy, the untamed spirit of nature that could nurture or destroy. To see him was to witness the impossible, a fire that did not burn, a light that did not fade, a god who existed in the liminal space between opposites. There is a tale told of a warrior who sought his aid. The warrior's lands had been ravaged by drought, the rivers reduced to trickles, the earth cracked and barren. Desperate, he stood at the edge of a great lake, its waters shimmering faintly under the pale sky. He called out to Apam Napad, his voice trembling but resolute. He did not ask for rain or mercy. He asked for strength. The water began to churn, the calm surface breaking into waves that crashed against the shore. The warrior stood his ground, his heart pounding in his chest. Then, from the center of the lake, Apam Napad emerged. His body was wreathed in flames that danced without consuming him, his eyes blazing like embers. The warrior fell to his knees, overwhelmed by the sheer power of the deity before him. You seek strength, Apam Napad said, his voice like the roar of the river, deep and unyielding. But strength is not given. It is forged. With a single motion, Apam Napad extended his hand, and the warrior felt the heat of the fire wash over him. It did not burn him, but he could feel it ignite something within him, a spark, a flame he had not known he carried. The warrior rose, his body trembling, not with fear, but with newfound power. He did not thank the god, for he knew that thanks were unnecessary. Apam Napad had not acted out of kindness, but out of purpose. The warrior left the lake, his heart burning with the fire of the waters. Apam Napad was more than a god of water. He was the force that connected fire and water, two elements that should not coexist yet thrived within him. He was the reminder that opposites could unite, that strength came not from domination but from harmony. He was the light within the depths, the fire that refused to be extinguished. But his power was not without consequence. There is another tale, one of a king who sought to control him. The king had heard of the fiery god and sought to harness his power, to use it to dominate his enemies and expand his empire. He built a massive dam across the sacred river where Apam Napad was said to dwell, his workers toiling day and night to trap the waters. As the dam rose higher, the river grew restless. The people whispered of the wrath of the god, but the king dismissed their fears. He stood on the dam, gazing out over the churning waters below, confident in his victory. Then, one night, the waters began to glow. The faint light grew brighter and brighter until it illuminated the sky. From the center of the river, Apam Napad emerged, his flames blazing with fury. The king stood frozen, his arrogance melting away as he faced the god he had sought to enslave. "You think you can control me?" Apam Napad's voice thundered, shaking the very earth. "You cannot control what is eternal. You cannot tame what was never yours." With a single wave of his hand, the waters surged forward, breaking through the dam with a force that no man could withstand. The river roared, its waters sweeping away the king's ambitions, his armies, his monuments. When the sun rose, the dam was gone, and the river flowed freely once more. The people returned to the banks of the river, their hearts heavy with loss, but filled with awe. They knelt by the water, their voices lifted in prayer, not out of fear, but out of reverence. They understood then that Apam Napad was not a god to be controlled or commanded. He was a force to be respected, a power that existed not for the whims of men, but for the balance of the world. To those who honored him, Apam Napad was a protector. His fire was not only destructive, but purifying. It burned away the falsehoods, the impurities, leaving only what was true and strong. He was the guardian of the sacred waters, the keeper of their power and mystery. His presence was a reminder that even within the calmest streams, there was a strength that could not be measured. Apam Napad was not just the fire within the waters. He was the fire within all living things, the spark of life that burned in every heart. He was the force that could destroy but also rebuild, the light that could blind but also guide. He was contradiction and harmony, chaos and order, destruction and creation. And so, the rivers continued to flow, their waters carrying the whispers of the God who dwelled within them. His flame burned on, unseen yet ever present, a reminder of the power that lay within the heart of the waters, and within the hearts of those who dared to seek him. Under the silvery glow of the stars, in a place where the air shimmered with an otherworldly energy, a plant grew. It stood alone, its slender stalks swaying gently in the breeze, crowned with golden blooms that seemed to glow with an inner light. This was no ordinary plant. This was Halma, sacred and eternal, the vessel of divine power and the essence of immortality. The stories say Halma was not planted by mortal hands. It sprouted from the tears of a god, falling onto the sacred earth as a gift to humanity. It was said to hold the mysteries of life itself, a bridge between the physical and the divine. To see Halma was to feel something awaken within, a stirring of the soul, a realization that life and eternity were not opposites, but reflections of the same truth. There was a young priest, untested and uncertain, who once sought Halma's wisdom. He had heard the elders speak of its power, of how its sap carried not only nourishment for the body, but also a connection to the divine. It was used in sacred rituals, its essence a conduit for prayers and blessings. Yet he felt unworthy, a mere mortal seeking something so profound. One moonlit night, he approached the sacred grove where Halma grew. His steps faltered as he neared the plant, his heart pounding with awe and fear. The air around it seemed alive, thrumming with a soft, melodic hum that resonated in his chest. He knelt before it, his hands trembling as he reached out to touch its leaves. The moment his fingers brushed the plant, a flood of warmth coursed through him. It was not the heat of fire, but the gentle embrace of life itself. Memories that were not his own filled his mind, ancient battles fought under the watchful eyes of gods, prayers whispered by those long forgotten, the first sunrise that graced the earth. He saw his ancestors, their faces radiant with hope and strength, and he felt their voices join his own. "Halma," he whispered, tears streaming down his face. "What am I to do with this life I have been given?" The plant swayed in silence, its golden blooms glowing brighter. The priest felt a calmness settle over him, as if the very earth beneath him whispered reassurance. He understood then that Halma did not answer with words. Its message was in the quiet, the stillness, the life it gave so freely. Halma's power was not confined to rituals or prayers. It was a symbol of renewal, of resilience. Its sap was said to bring healing to the sick, clarity to the confused, and strength to the weary. Yet, its power was not to be taken lightly. Those who sought to use it for greed or personal gain found themselves consumed by their desires, unable to grasp the true essence of its gift. There is a tale of a king who coveted Halma's immortality. He sent his men to gather its sap, believing it would make him invincible. They returned with golden bowls filled with the sacred liquid, but when the king drank, he felt nothing. Angered, he ordered more sap to be brought, draining the plant until it withered. Yet, no matter how much he consumed, he remained unchanged. The king's greed blinded him to the truth. Halma's power was not in its physical form, but in its spirit. It was not a tool to conquer death, but a reminder of life's sanctity. In his arrogance, the king had taken without understanding, and the divine gift slipped through his grasp. The people mourned the loss of Halma, believing its power gone forever. But one day, in the same sacred grove where it had first appeared, a new shoot emerged from the earth. It grew slowly, its golden blooms unfurling like tiny suns, a testament to the resilience of life and the enduring nature of the divine. The people understood then that Halma could not be destroyed, for it was not merely a plant. It was life itself, eternal and unyielding. To this day, Halma's essence is honored. Its role in ceremonies is more than symbolic. It is a reminder of the connection between the heavens and the earth, the mortal and the divine. It teaches that immortality is not found in escaping death, but in embracing life fully and living with purpose and reverence. The stories of Halma are told with hushed reverence, passed from one generation to the next. They speak of its golden light, its gentle strength, and its unwavering presence. They remind all who hear them that within each of us lies a spark of the divine, a connection to the eternal. Halma grows, still, in places where the sacred and the mortal meet. Its roots sink deep into the earth, drawing life from the soil, while its blooms reach toward the sky, a bridge between worlds. And when the wind moves through its leaves, it carries a song of life, of hope, of eternity. Those who listen carefully can hear it, a melody that stirs the soul and reminds us that even in the fleeting moments of our lives, something eternal endures. The night sky stretched endlessly, stars shimmering like countless eyes watching from above. Yet among them was one that stood apart, its glow fiercer, its presence commanding. It was Tiria, the warrior star, blazing with purpose as it pierced the heavens. Where others merely shone, Tiria burned, and his light was a beacon of hope for a world parched by despair. Far below, the earth lay cracked and dry, a barren wasteland where rivers had shriveled into dusty scars. The people knelt on the hardened ground, their prayers rising into the still air, carried by whispers of desperation. They called for Tiria, the rainbringer, the celestial champion who fought for life itself. But this was not a battle that could be won with light alone. In the unseen corners of the cosmos, shadows stirred. The demons of drought, ancient and relentless, rose from the depths of the void. Their breath was the searing wind that scorched the fields, their claws were the invisible chains that held the rain captive. They fed on suffering, thriving in the emptiness they created. Tistrius saw the suffering, felt the anguish of the earth as if it were his own. He knew he could not ignore the cries. To bring the rain, he would have to face the demons in their own realm, a place of unending thirst and despair. The thought did not frighten him, for Tistria was not a star that wavered. He was a warrior, and his light was a weapon. As he descended into the darkness, his radiant form transformed. He became a magnificent white stallion, his mane gleaming like molten silver, his hooves striking sparks with every step. In this form, he carried the hopes of the world, galloping across the void with unyielding determination. The demons awaited him, their forms shifting and grotesque, eyes burning with malice. They laughed as Tistria approached, mocking the lone star who dared to challenge them. But their laughter faltered when they saw the fire in his eyes, the resolve that burned brighter than any star. The battle began, a clash of forces so powerful it shook the very fabric of existence. The demons lashed out with tendrils of darkness, trying to snuff out his light. But Tistria's hooves struck with the force of thunder, his mane whipping like a storm, and for every blow he took, he returned it tenfold. The void echoed with the roars of the demons and the fierce, unrelenting cries of the warrior star. At times, the darkness seemed to overwhelm him. The demons coiled around him, their voices whispering doubts, their shadows seeping into his brilliant light. Yet even in those moments, Tistria's flame did not falter. He thought of the dry rivers, the wilted crops, the children whose eyes held the weight of hunger. He thought of the prayers sent to the heavens, fragile yet unbroken. And with each thought, his strength surged. In the midst of the battle, the first drop of rain fell. It was small, almost imperceptible, but it carried the promise of renewal. The demons hissed, their forms recoiling as more drops followed, a gentle patter growing into a cascade. Tistria pushed forward, his light blazing as he drove the darkness back. The rain began to pour, a torrent that washed over the parched earth, filling the rivers and soaking into the soil. The people looked to the sky, their faces turned upward, tears mingling with the rain as they whispered words of gratitude. They knew the rain was not just water, it was life, a gift wrested from the clutches of despair by a warrior who refused to yield. The demons, defeated, slumped back into the void, their power diminished but not destroyed. Tistria stood in the downpour, his form once again radiant, his light piercing the darkness. He had won, but he knew the battle would not be his last. The dropped demons would rise again, as they always did, testing the limits of hope and resilience. But for now, the earth was alive, its heart beating once more. The fields turned green, the rivers swelled, and the air was filled with the laughter of children and the songs of grateful hearts. Tistria watched from the heavens, his light a reminder of the battle fought, the sacrifices made, and the unyielding strength of a star that refused to dim. Even today, when the rains come after a long drought, people look to the brightest star in the night sky. They tell their children of Tistria, the warrior who fought for them, who faced the darkness so that the earth could thrive again. They remind one another that no matter how deep the shadows, there is always a light that burns brighter. And that light will always answer the call. The battlefield was silent, the air heavy with anticipation. Warriors stood frozen, their weapons trembling in their hands, as an ominous shadow crept over the horizon. It was the kind of quiet that felt alive, the kind that pressed against the chest, warning of something far greater than mere mortal conflict. Then, from the haze of uncertainty, a figure emerged, his presence commanding and electric. It was Vragna, the god of victory, a force of nature who bore no single face. He was a whirlwind of power, a deity who could shapeshift into 10 different forms, each embodying a facet of his strength. His arrival on the battlefield was not marked by a war cry or a clash of swords, but by a sense of inevitable triumph, as though the very winds whispered his name in reverence. He began as the wind itself, invisible but undeniable, sweeping across the plain. The soldiers felt him before they saw him, a rush of air that carried the scent of courage and sent shivers down their spines. He was both the storm that toppled the strongest oak and the gentle breeze that whispered reassurance to those in despair. It was in this form that he scattered the seeds of doubt among the enemy, sowing confusion and fear. Then he became a bull, massive and unyielding, his hooves striking the earth with thunderous force. His breath was steam, his eyes burning with an intensity that set enemies fleeing without a fight. The bull was his form of brute strength, a symbol of power that could not be denied or overcome. In the midst of battle, he transformed again, this time into a magnificent stallion. His sleek body shimmered as if forged from the essence of sunlight, his mane flowing like liquid fire. He galloped into the fray, carrying the hopes of the warriors who followed him. His speed was unmatched, his spirit untamed, and wherever his hooves touched the earth, courage blossomed. But Vragna was not just a figure of might. He became a falcon, his wings cutting through the sky like blades, his sharp eyes piercing the chaos below. From above, he saw everything, the movements of the enemy, the hidden traps, the paths to victory. His vision was unclouded, his aim unerring, and in this form, he guided his people like a celestial compass. The boar was his next shape, a beast of ferocity and unrelenting determination. Covered in bristles as sharp as spears, he charged into the enemy lines, scattering them like leaves before a gale. The boar was fear incarnate, a reminder that victory was not always graceful but could be won through sheer, stubborn will. When the battle shifted to cunning and strategy, Vragna became a cunning fox. His steps were silent, his movements calculated, and his mind a maze of tactics. He infiltrated the enemy's ranks, sowing discord and confusion, his sly grin a silent promise that he would outwit them at every turn. But when the people needed hope, he transformed into a golden youth, his face radiant with the glow of the morning sun. His presence lifted the spirits of those who had begun to falter, reminding them of what they were fighting for. In this form, he was not just a god but a beacon, his every word and gesture imbued with the promise of a brighter future. In moments of pure, unstoppable wrath, he took the form of fire. Flames danced around him, their heat scalding and purifying. He was destruction, yes, but also renewal, burning away what was weak and flawed to make way for something stronger. The fire was his form of ultimate transformation, a reminder that victory often required sacrifice. The rams followed, symbols of persistence and balance, their curved horns gleaming under the sun as they charged into the fray. They embodied the steady, unyielding spirit that carried warriors through even the longest battles, the quiet strength that endured when all else faltered. Finally, he became a man. Not a deity cloaked in divinity, but a warrior like those who fought beside him. In this form, he was at his most vulnerable and yet his most inspiring, standing shoulder to shoulder with those who placed their faith in him. He bore their burdens as his own, reminding them that even gods could fight with mortal hands. Each transformation told its own story, carried its own weight, and served its own purpose. Vragna was not a god confined by a single identity but a being of infinite adaptability. He embodied the belief that victory was not a singular path but a shifting, evolving journey, one that required strength, cunning, resilience, and above all, the ability to change when the moment demanded it. As the battle raged on, Vragna moved seamlessly between his forms, each transformation a testament to his power and purpose. The enemies faltered, their spirits breaking under the weight of his presence, while his followers surged forward, their hearts ablaze with newfound courage. When the dust finally settled and the battlefield lay silent once more, there were no grand speeches, no moments of triumphal boasting. Vragna had vanished, his forms dissolving into the air like whispers carried on the wind. But his spirit remained, etched into the hearts of those who had witnessed his might. They knew he would return when they needed him, taking whatever shape was required to lead them to victory once again. The golden light of the sun bathed the land, casting long shadows over the hills and valleys. This was a world in its prime, brimming with life and abundance. At its heart stood Yima, the first king, his presence as luminous as the sun itself. He was no ordinary ruler. His very being seemed to radiate warmth and prosperity, and wherever he walked, the earth blossomed with life. Crops grew taller, rivers flowed clearer, and the beasts of the land gathered near him as if drawn to his gentle strength. But even the most golden of ages is not immune to shadows. One day, the divine voice of Ahura Mazda reached Yima, solemn and unyielding. A terrible winter was coming, a frost so relentless that it would grip the world in icy despair. The earth, once teeming with life, would grow barren, and the skies would remain gray and unyielding. The frost would come not as punishment but as a trial, to test the endurance of life itself. Yima listened, his heart heavy with the weight of such knowledge. He could feel the pain of the world in his chest, a pulse of anguish that no king should have to bear. But Yima was not just a king, he was a protector, a shield between his people and the encroaching darkness. And so, even as dread coursed through him, he resolved to act. He turned to his people, his golden aura dimming not with fear, but with the gravity of the moment. "The frost is coming," he said, his voice steady despite the tremble in his heart. "But we will not succumb. We will endure." His words were not a plea but a promise, one that sparked hope in the faces of those who gathered around him. Yima called upon the wisdom granted by Ahura Mazda. He was shown a vision of the Vara, a refuge unlike anything the world had known. It would be a sanctuary hidden beneath the earth, a place where life could continue, sheltered from the icy grip of the coming storm. In this place, no frost could bite, no winter could steal the breath of the living. With a determination that burned brighter than his golden light, Yima began the task of creating the Vara. He did not do it alone. His people worked beside him, their faith in their king turning fear into fuel. Stone by stone, they carved out the refuge, their hands roughened and bloody but unwavering. The Vara began to take shape, a vast underground world with rivers running like veins through its core and chambers filled with the warmth of life. Yima ensured that the Vara would not merely sustain life but celebrate it. He gathered the finest of every living thing, flocks of birds with feathers like gemstones, animals of every shape and size, and seeds of plants that promised renewal. The Vara became a treasure chest of existence, a hymn to the beauty of the world above. Even as the frost began to creep closer, Yima's creation thrummed with vitality. The frost arrived as Ahura Mazda had warned, descending upon the world with a ferocity that silenced even the bravest hearts. The skies grew thick with a gray that swallowed the sun, and the earth hardened under its icy grip. Rivers froze, forests withered, and silence fell over the land, a quiet so profound it felt as though the world itself had stopped breathing. But beneath the earth, the Vara thrived. The warmth of life pulsed through its chambers, a defiance against the cold that raged above. People sang songs of gratitude, their voices echoing through the stone walls, blending with the rustle of leaves and the gentle hum of flowing water. It was not merely survival, it was a promise that life would rise again. Yima walked among his people, his golden light dim but enduring. He carried the weight of the world's survival on his shoulders, and though it bowed him, it did not break him. Children ran to him, their laughter a balm against the sorrow of what they had lost. He knelt among them, his hands rough from labor but gentle as they rested on their small shoulders. "This is not the end," he told them, and they believed him, for how could they not? Yima's words carried the strength of a king who had faced despair and refused to yield. Time passed, and the frost showed no mercy. Yet the Vara stood strong, a testament to Yima's foresight and the resilience of his people. The animals thrived, the plants bore fruit, and the rivers sang their gentle song. In the darkness of the frost, the Vara became a star, its light unseen but undeniable. But Yima knew the Vara was not meant to be a permanent home. It was a bridge, a shelter to protect life until the frost loosened its grip and the world above could heal. He longed for the sun, for the open skies and the laughter of his people carried by the wind. Every moment spent underground was a reminder of what had been lost and what awaited them if they could endure. Even as his golden light began to wane, Yima never faltered. He was the first king, a protector whose legacy was etched not in stone but in the survival of those who trusted him. The frost may have stolen the world above, but it could not touch the heart of the Vara, nor the spirit of the king who refused to let life fade. When the frost finally began to retreat, when the first rays of sunlight pierced the gray skies, Yima stood at the entrance of the Vara. He looked out at a world in ruins, but felt no despair. He saw not the death that had passed, but the life that was yet to come. He stepped forward, his golden aura flickering like the first flame in the dark, and behind him, his people followed, carrying with them the essence of the Vara, the unyielding belief that life would always find a way. The air grew heavy with an unspoken tension, a weight that pressed down on existence itself. It was as if the world had held its breath, waiting for something dark and ancient to stir. In the shadows of creation, where light hesitated to reach, chaos began to take form. These were not beings born of love or light, but creatures forged from the fractures of discord, the raw essence of destruction. The first whispers of their presence were faint, carried on winds that chilled even the sunniest days. Crops withered without explanation, rivers ran dry despite the rains, and the animals of the land grew restless, their eyes reflecting a primal fear. These were the signs of something unnatural, something malevolent creeping into the world. And then, they appeared. The devs did not walk among mortals as gods did. They emerged from the unseen places, their forms shifting and unnatural, their very presence twisting the air around them. To look upon a dev was to feel the sharp edge of despair, to see the unraveling of all that held the world together. Their eyes burned with a hatred that had no beginning and no end, a rage as ancient as the void itself. They came as a force of opposition, not to create but to undo. Wherever they roamed, harmony fractured. The balance between light and dark faltered, and the carefully woven tapestry of existence began to fray. They did not speak in the tongues of mortals or gods, for their language was chaos, storms that tore apart the heavens, earthquakes that split the earth, and silence so profound it made the heart forget how to beat. It was said that they were born from the same primordial chaos that gave rise to creation. But where the gods sought to bring order to the void, the devs thrived in its disarray. They were the embodiment of everything that opposed the gods, destruction against creation, falsehood against truth, hatred against love. They were not merely enemies of the divine, they were its antithesis. The leader among them was Eshma, whose name was spoken only in hushed tones, if at all. Eshma was chaos incarnate, a being whose rage could shatter mountains and whose hatred could extinguish stars. He did not need an army to spread his influence, his presence alone was enough to corrupt and consume. His form was ever-changing, a swirling maelstrom of fire, smoke, and shadows that devoured the light around him. To hear his voice was to feel one's soul pulled into the abyss, lost in the cacophony of despair. But Eshma was not alone. The devs were many, each one embodying a different shade of destruction. Bushiasta, the spirit of sloth, spread apathy and decay, making even the strongest wills falter. Endar brought war, his blood-soaked hands forever clutching weapons forged in hatred. Terramedai whispered deceit, unraveling the bonds of trust and loyalty. Each dev was a force unto itself, but together, they became an unstoppable tide of ruin. The gods watched from their celestial thrones, their hearts heavy with the knowledge that these forces were not merely enemies to be vanquished. The devs were a reflection of the cracks in creation, the inevitable consequence of free will and the battle for balance. To fight them was not just to face an opponent, but to confront the very nature of existence itself. Mortals, caught in the crossfire, could do little but pray. Temples became fortresses of hope, filled with offerings and tears as people begged the gods for protection. But the devs could not be kept out by walls or chants. They seeped into the hearts of men and women, whispering promises of power, vengeance, and freedom from the constraints of order. It was in these moments that the true horror of the devs revealed itself. They did not need to destroy with their hands, they could unravel from within. Villages turned against one another, once loyal friends became bitter enemies, and families were torn apart by suspicion and greed. The devs thrived on this discord, feeding off the anguish they sowed. They were not bound by time or space, their chaos spread like an infection, reaching even those who thought themselves safe. But for all their destruction, the devs were not invincible. Their very nature was their weakness. They thrived on chaos, but chaos is, by its nature, unstable. The gods knew this, and they sought to use it against them. The divine forces banded together, wielding the power of truth and light, not as weapons, but as shields to protect what was good and pure. The battle was not one of swords and blood, but of will and endurance. The gods stood firm against the tide of chaos, their light flickering but never extinguished. Mortals, inspired by the courage of the divine, found strength in their unity. They rebuilt what the devs destroyed, their hands steady even as their hearts trembled. But the devs were not defeated. They could not be destroyed, for chaos is as eternal as creation itself. They retreated, their shadows lingering in the corners of existence, waiting for cracks to appear in the armor of order. The gods knew they would return, and so they remained vigilant, their eyes ever watchful for the signs of their resurgence. The devs had shown the world the cost of imbalance, the fragility of harmony. Their presence was a reminder of the constant battle between creation and destruction, a battle that could never truly be won but must always be fought. The winds howled as though the sky itself was screaming. Mount Hara stood defiant, its jagged peaks piercing the heavens, cloaked in eternal snow that gleamed like shards of broken glass under the sun's fading light. The mountain had witnessed countless seasons, its stoic silence unbroken through the eons. But now, that silence was shattered. The air crackled with energy, an oppressive charge that weighed heavy on the hearts of those who dared to approach. At its base, the forces of chaos gathered, a writhing sea of shadows and malice. The devs, twisted beings of destruction, filled the valley with their guttural roars. Their forms were as varied as nightmares, each more grotesque than the last. Some loomed like mountains themselves, their flesh made of ash and fire, while others slithered with a serpent's grace, leaving trails of venom in their wake. Their leader, Eshma, stood at the forefront, his eyes burning like twin suns of hatred, his voice a booming cacophony that made the earth tremble. Above them, the gods gathered on the slopes, their light piercing through the darkness like beacons of hope. Ahura Mazda, the Lord of Wisdom, stood at the summit, his presence radiating a calm that seemed almost at odds with the chaos below. By his side were his loyal deities, Tiria, the shining star, Mitra, the unyielding protector of truth, and Anahita, the radiant goddess of waters. Each bore the weight of what was to come, their expressions a mixture of resolve and sorrow. The siege began with a soundless pause, a heartbeat of stillness before the storm. Then, Eshma raised his clawed hand, and the valley erupted. Flames shot into the sky, a torrent of destruction that surged toward the mountain's defenders. The gods met it with their own power, a shield of light that flared against the onslaught, holding the chaos at bay. The clash sent shockwaves through the mountain, splitting the earth and sending boulders crashing into the abyss below. The battle raged on, neither side yielding an inch. Tiria charged forward, his spear gleaming with celestial light. He struck with precision, his every blow a star falling from the heavens. Against him rose Endar, the dev of war, his laughter a brutal symphony that echoed through the valley. Their clash was thunder and lightning, a storm that raged across the slopes. Anahita moved like a river in flood, her power flowing through the battlefield. With a sweep of her arm, torrents of water surged forth, extinguishing the devs' flames and washing away their venomous taint. Yet, even she faltered against Teramatai, whose whispers of deceit twisted the minds of those who heard them. Anahita fought not just with her strength, but with her spirit, her unwavering belief in purity shielding her from corruption. Mitra stood like an unbroken wall, his golden sword slicing through the dark tide. He roared his oaths aloud, his voice a clarion call that rallied the gods and struck fear into the hearts of their enemies. Against him rose Bushiasta, the spirit of sloth, whose very presence sapped strength and will. The battle between them was a grinding war of attrition, each strike of Mitra's blade pushing back the devs' encroaching despair. The mountain itself became a battleground, its slopes scorched by fire and carved by divine wrath. Trees that had stood for centuries were reduced to ash, rivers that had flowed freely were turned to steam. The very air seemed alive with the clash of powers, the cries of gods and demons reverberating through the peaks. The skies darkened, as if mourning the destruction, while the ground beneath trembled, torn between creation and chaos. And then came the turning point. Eshma, who had watched from the shadows, stepped forward. His form swelled with power, his rage fueling the storm that now engulfed the battlefield. With a single, earth-shaking step, he ascended the mountain, his eyes locked on Ahura Mazda. The other gods moved to intercept him, but he swatted them aside as though they were mere insects. Tistria's spear shattered against his hide, Mitra's sword glanced off his flaming skin. Even Anahita's waters turned to steam before they could touch him. Eshma reached the summit, his laughter a guttural roar that drowned out the cries of the wounded. He raised his claws, aiming to strike down the source of all light and wisdom. But Ahura Mazda did not falter. He stood firm, his gaze unwavering, his voice calm yet commanding. "You cannot win," Ahura Mazda said, his words carrying a weight that silenced even the storm. Eshma snarled, his claws descending like falling stars. But as they neared, Ahura Mazda raised his hand, and the light that emanated from him grew blinding. It was not the harsh light of fire or the searing heat of the sun, but a soft, pure radiance that filled the air with warmth and peace. The darkness recoiled, the devs shrieking as their forms began to dissolve. Eshma roared in defiance, his strength faltering as the light consumed him. He thrashed and clawed, but it was as though the very essence of chaos was being undone. Finally, with a deafening cry, he crumbled, his form dissipating into the void from which he had come. The battlefield fell silent. The devs, leaderless and broken, retreated into the shadows, their cries fading into the distance. The gods, battered and weary, stood victorious atop the mountain. Yet their faces were not those of triumph, but of sorrow. They had won the battle, but the scars it left would remain forever etched into the world. Mount Hara, once a symbol of unyielding strength, now bore the marks of the conflict. Its peaks were scorched, its rivers dry, its forests reduced to ash. But in its heart, where the gods had stood against chaos, a light still glimmered. It was faint, like the first star of evening, but it was enough. It was hope. The air was heavy with silence, the kind that came before a storm. Deep within the unseen shadows of existence, a murmur began to stir. It was not the gentle whisper of creation, but something cold and venomous. It was a rebellion, a defiance against the very fabric of life itself. In the infinite expanse of the void, Ngramenu, the essence of destruction and darkness, sat brooding. His thoughts coiled like serpents, each one feeding on the bitterness of his hatred. He had watched the world unfold under the guiding hand of Ahura Mazda. The stars had been placed with care, rivers had been coaxed into existence, and the earth had been shaped to cradle life. And yet, to Ngramenu, it was all a mockery. The harmony of creation burned his being, a searing reminder of the light he could never embody. His existence was chaos, his purpose to unravel the order that stood in his way. Ngramenu stretched out his will into the shadows, and from the darkness, beings began to form. They were reflections of his rage, twisted shapes molded by hatred and hunger. The devs were born, their forms grotesque yet powerful, their essence tied to the destructive forces of nature. Eshma, the embodiment of wrath, stood among them, his fiery eyes promising endless fury. Tiria, with her beguiling whispers, sowed lies and discord. Each dev carried a piece of Ngramenu's malice, a fragment of his relentless rebellion. The pact was forged in silence, without words, for words were the tools of creation. Instead, it was a bond of intent, a shared purpose to tear apart the world and rebuild it in chaos. Ngramenu promised them dominion over the shattered remnants of existence, a world where only destruction thrived. The devs, bound by their creator's will, pledged their allegiance, their forms trembling with the anticipation of destruction. The rebellion began with the desecration of light. The stars, once bright beacons of hope, began to dim as the devs unleashed their fury upon the cosmos. Eshma roared, his flames consuming everything in his path, leaving nothing but ash and ruin. Tiramai's lies spread like poison, infecting the minds of mortals and gods alike, turning trust into suspicion and love into hatred. The devs reveled in the chaos, their laughter echoing through the void, a mockery of the harmony they sought to destroy. Ngramenu watched, his gaze unflinching, as the world began to fracture under his will. The skies darkened, the rivers ran dry, and the earth trembled beneath the weight of his malice. Mortals cried out for salvation, their voices drowned by the howls of the devs. Yet, amidst the despair, the light of Ahura Mazda persisted, unwavering in the face of annihilation. The gods rallied, their strength fueled by the determination to protect what they had created. Tiria rose, his starry spear gleaming with defiance as he confronted the forces of darkness. Mitra's blade cut through the shadows, each strike a promise to uphold truth and justice. Anahita, her waters flowing with purity, cleansed the taint left by the dev's destruction. Together, they stood against the tide of chaos, their unity a beacon of hope. But Ingramenu was relentless. He descended upon the battlefield, his presence a void that consumed all light and warmth. His laughter was a chilling symphony, a reminder of his inevitable victory. He faced Ahura Mazda, the two embodiments of existence standing on the precipice of creation. Their clash shook the very foundations of reality, the collision of light and darkness resonating through the cosmos. The devs, emboldened by their master's power, surged forward, their ferocity unmatched. Mortals, caught in the crossfire, fell to despair, their hearts burdened by the weight of the conflict. Ingramenu whispered into their minds, feeding their fears and doubts, turning their prayers into curses. The world teetered on the edge, the balance between creation and destruction hanging by a thread. And yet, even in the face of overwhelming darkness, Ahura Mazda stood resolute. He reached out, not with anger or hatred, but with compassion. His light extended toward the mortals, a gentle reminder that even in the darkest moments, hope could endure. His presence was a balm to their wounds, a shield against the encroaching chaos. The mortals, inspired by his unwavering strength, began to resist. They rebuilt what was destroyed, their hands guided by faith and determination. The battle raged on, neither side gaining ground. Ingramenu's fury grew with each passing moment, his hatred consuming him as he failed to extinguish the light of creation. His pact with the devs, once a symbol of his defiance, became a shackle, binding him to an endless war. The devs, once filled with the promise of victory, began to falter, their forms crumbling under the weight of Ahura Mazda's light. The rebellion, though devastating, could not destroy the essence of creation. The world bore the scars of the conflict, but it endured, its spirit unbroken. Ingramenu retreated into the shadows, his defeat not one of annihilation but of resilience. He remained, a lingering threat, his hatred simmering in the darkness, waiting for the moment to strike again. The gods stood together, their strength a testament to their unity and purpose. They mourned the loss and destruction but found solace in the perseverance of life. The mortals, though battered and weary, began to rebuild, their faith in the light unshaken. And so, the war against creation continued, an eternal battle between light and darkness, hope and despair, creation and destruction. The rebellion of Ingramenu and the devs was not a victory for either side, but a reminder of the fragile balance that held existence together. Time is an ocean without a shore, its waves relentless, its expanse infinite. At the center of this boundless sea stood Zervan, the eternal being who held the threads of existence in his grasp. To mortals and gods alike, he was a paradox, a being unbound by beginnings or endings, a force both omnipotent and indifferent. Yet even the eternal can falter, and even time can betray itself. Zervan's gaze stretched beyond the present, past, and future. He saw all, knew all. It was a burden he bore in silence, for who could share the weight of eternity? His domain was vast, encompassing the lifetimes of stars and the fleeting whispers of mortal breaths. From his throne of infinite stillness, he watched as the cosmos unfolded, an endless cycle of creation and destruction. Yet, deep within, a single seed of doubt took root. It was small, almost imperceptible, but like a crack in a mountain, it threatened to grow. He had seen the clash between Ahura Mazda and Ingramenu before it began. He had foreseen the light and darkness locked in eternal battle, neither truly victorious, each feeding off the other's presence. And in his timeless wisdom, Zervan questioned, was there no escape from this cycle? Was the cosmos doomed to repeat the same struggles, the same pain, forever? This doubt festered, its tendrils weaving into Zervan's thoughts. Perhaps he, the embodiment of time itself, could intervene. Perhaps he could tip the balance, bring an end to the stalemate, and create a new order. But to intervene meant to choose, and choice was a path fraught with peril, even for one so powerful. In a moment that spanned eternity, Zervan made his decision. He would not simply observe, he would act. His power was infinite, his will unyielding. Yet in that act of defiance against the natural order, something changed. The eternal became flawed, the infallible became fallible. Time itself shuddered, and the consequences began to ripple through existence. Zervan's plan was simple in its ambition and devastating in its execution. He would bring forth a being that could unify the fractured cosmos, an entity born of both light and darkness, capable of transcending duality. He poured his essence into this creation, molding it with precision and care. But Zervan underestimated the forces he sought to control. In his hubris, he believed he could bind opposites together, that he could forge harmony from discord. The being he created was neither light nor darkness, but a volatile fusion of the two. It bore the potential for greatness, but also the seeds of ruin. Zervan named it Zervan Akarana, the child of infinite time, and watched as it took form. Yet even as he beheld his creation, he realized his mistake. The balance he sought to achieve was unstable, the unity he envisioned crumbling under the weight of its contradictions. Ahura Mazda and Ingramenu, the eternal rivals, sensed the disturbance. They turned their gazes to Zervan, their expressions unreadable. Was it betrayal they felt? Pity? Or perhaps a sorrowful understanding of the burden that had led Zervan to this point? The cosmos trembled as the two forces confronted their creator, their words echoing with a power that transcended language. Why? Ahura Mazda's voice was calm but heavy with the weight of betrayal. Why would you disrupt the balance you were meant to uphold? Ingramenu's laughter was sharp, mocking. Did you think you could control us, Father? Did you think time could bind chaos and order into one? Zervan stood silent, his form towering yet diminished. He had no answer, for the truth was laid bare. In his desperation to break the cycle, he had created a new one, more destructive and chaotic than the last. Zervan Akarana, the child of his hubris, writhed in torment, its essence tearing itself apart. The gods watched as the fabric of existence began to unravel. Stars flickered and died, the heavens split asunder, and the earth itself groaned under the strain. Zervan, for all his power, could do nothing but bear witness to the destruction he had wrought. Time, once unyielding, now bent and twisted, its flow disrupted by the chaos unleashed. In his final act, Zervan sought to undo his mistake. He reached out to his creation, his voice trembling with an emotion he had never known, regret. My child, he whispered, I sought to free you from this endless struggle. I sought to give you purpose beyond the war of light and dark. But I have failed you. Zervan Akarana turned to its creator, its form a shifting mass of light and shadow. For a moment, there was silence, as if the cosmos itself held its breath. Then, in a voice that echoed with both agony and understanding, it spoke. Father, you gave me existence, but you also gave me your doubt. I am your reflection, your flaw made manifest. I cannot be what you wished, for I am born of contradiction. With those words, Zervan Akarana began to dissolve, its essence scattering across the cosmos. The destruction ceased, the heavens mended, and the stars burned brightly once more. But the scars remained, on the world, on the gods, and on Zervan himself. The god of infinite time, once unshakable, now stood broken. His betrayal was not of others, but of himself, of the principles he had sworn to uphold. He retreated into the depths of existence, his form fading into the currents of time. Some say he became one with the flow of eternity, a silent observer once more, his voice forever silenced by his shame. Others believe he lingers, a shadow of his former self, haunted by the echoes of his failure. And so, Zervan, the eternal, fell, not with a thunderous crash, but with the quiet, mournful passing of time itself. His story became a cautionary tale, a reminder that even the most powerful beings are not immune to doubt, that even time can betray its own purpose. The stars hung heavy in the velvet sky, their light trembling as if they bore witness to a truth too grand, too weighty to be uttered aloud. The air carried an ancient whisper, soft but insistent, curling like smoke through the hearts of those who dared to listen. It was a promise older than the mountains, a thread woven through the very fabric of existence. Somewhere, in the unseen folds of time, a savior would rise, a being of light and justice, the one who would restore balance to a fractured world. The prophecy spoke of Saoshyant, the savior whose name meant the one who brings benefit. He would be born not of chance, but of divine purpose, his arrival foretold in the stars and the sacred hymns. His presence was said to be a balm for the weary, a beacon for the lost. In a world clawing at the edges of darkness, his light would pierce through, unwavering and pure. But the world was not kind to hope. It crushed it underfoot, mocking those who dared to believe. The earth groaned with the weight of its despair, rivers ran dry, crops withered, and the laughter of children faded into distant memory. Evil thrived in the shadows, spreading its tendrils across the land. Angramenu's forces marched unchecked, their laughter filling the night as they reveled in chaos. Yet amidst the despair, the faithful clung to the prophecy as though it were a lifeline. The words of the ancient texts echoed in their minds, a steady rhythm against the pounding storm. Saoshyant will come. He would rise not as a conqueror but as a healer. His power would not be in the sword, but in the truth. He would mend the broken and breathe life into the ashes. The sacred text spoke of his birth as an event marked by cosmic wonder. Born of a virgin, conceived in purity, his very being would carry the essence of divine light. His lineage stretched back to Zarathustra himself, the prophet who had ignited the flame of righteousness in a world shrouded in ignorance. Saoshyant's birth would signal the dawn of a new era, one where the scales would finally tip in favor of good. Time moved sluggishly, as though it too awaited the Savior's arrival. Generations passed, each one straining to catch a glimpse of the promised one. Every comet that streaked across the sky, every unexpected bloom in the dead of winter, brought whispers of his coming. But Saoshyant did not appear. Not yet. And so, the prophecy became more than a promise, it became a test of faith. Some questioned its truth, their doubt creeping in like a slow poison. Others clung to it with desperate fervor, weaving tales of the Savior into their lullabies and prayers. For them, Saoshyant was not just a savior, but a reason to keep breathing, a reason to hope when all else seemed lost. The world continued to decay, its wounds deepening. Wars raged, blood staining the soil as kings and tyrants fought for fleeting power. But the prophecy remained, untouched by the pettiness of men. Its words were etched into the hearts of the faithful, their rhythm like a heartbeat, steady and enduring. And then, there were signs. Small, almost imperceptible at first, a sudden burst of rain in a land parched for years, a child's laughter breaking through the silence of grief. The stars themselves seemed to shift, aligning in patterns that whispered of change. The faithful knelt in prayer, their voices trembling as they uttered the words they had longed to say, "He is coming." Saoshyant's arrival would not be a spectacle for the powerful. He would not emerge in the halls of kings or the temples of priests. Instead, the prophecy foretold that he would rise from the humblest of places, among the forgotten and the downtrodden. His light would shine brightest where the shadows were deepest. And when he came, the world would tremble, not in fear, but in awe. The mountains would bow, the rivers would dance, and the very air would hum with the promise of renewal. The devs, those monstrous embodiments of chaos, would be driven back, their shrieks swallowed by the earth as it reclaimed its balance. Angramenyu himself would be cast into the void, his darkness consumed by Saoshyant's light. But the prophecy also spoke of sacrifice. The Savior's path would not be an easy one. He would bear the weight of the world's suffering, his shoulders heavy with the burdens of humanity. He would face trials that would test his spirit, battles that would scar his soul. Yet he would endure, for his purpose was greater than himself. He was the embodiment of hope, a living reminder that even in the darkest of times, light could still prevail. The faithful dreamed of the day when Saoshyant would stand before them, his presence a radiant force that could not be denied. They imagined the moment when his voice would ring out, not with the thunder of command, but with the gentle assurance of truth. "Fear not," he would say. "The end of suffering is near." And then, as the prophecy foretold, the world would begin to heal. The waters would flow again, clear and abundant. The fields would bloom with life, their colors vibrant against the backdrop of a renewed earth. The laughter of children would fill the air, a sound so pure it could banish the lingering echoes of despair. Saoshyant's reign would not be one of domination but of restoration. He would guide humanity not as a ruler but as a teacher, showing them the path to harmony and righteousness. Under his light, the fractures of the world would mend, and the eternal struggle between good and evil would finally come to an end. The faithful waited, their hearts steady with belief. They knew that Saoshyant would come, not when they expected it, but when the world needed him most. And in that moment, when all seemed lost, the Savior would rise. The prophecy was clear, hope would endure, and light would prevail. The wind carried the scent of earth and blood, mingling with the distant cries of battle. The sun hung low in the sky, casting a golden haze over a world caught in a relentless struggle between chaos and order. It was in this age, when gods waged their celestial wars and the devs unleashed their fury upon creation, that mortals began to rise, their hearts ablaze with courage. They were the unlikeliest of heroes, plucked from the ranks of farmers, hunters, and wanderers, chosen by the divine to wield powers they scarcely understood. Their stories began in the quiet corners of the world, far from the thundering clashes of gods and demons. A shepherd, tending his flock on a hillside, felt the touch of divine purpose in the whisper of the wind. A potter, her hands caked with clay, saw visions of battles yet to come in the flicker of her kiln's flames. A young orphan, hardened by years of survival, dreamed of a sword glowing with celestial fire. These were not warriors by birth, but by destiny, and they bore the weight of the gods' hopes on their mortal shoulders. The first to rise was a humble blacksmith named Arash, his hands calloused from years of forging tools and plows. One fateful night, as he worked in his dimly lit forge, the air grew thick with a presence he could not see. The flames leapt higher, and from the roaring fire emerged a figure clad in shimmering light. It spoke without words, its message carving itself into Arash's soul: the world needed a champion. And so, the blacksmith became a warrior, wielding a hammer infused with the strength of the gods. With every swing, the earth trembled, and the devs recoiled in fear. Others followed. There was Mitra, a healer whose gentle touch could mend not just flesh, but the very essence of life. Her path was one of mercy, yet she stood unflinching before the horrors of war. Where she walked, hope blossomed, her presence a balm to those who had all but surrendered to despair. And then there was Kavi, a poet whose words wove magic into the air, his voice rising above the clamor of battle to inspire those who fought alongside him. His verses were not mere songs but weapons, striking at the hearts of the devs with the sharpness of truth. These heroes, scattered across the land, were bound by an unspoken pact, to fight, to endure, and to protect the fragile beauty of the world. Their connection to the gods was both a blessing and a burden. The divine gifts they bore came with a price, visions of the future that filled their nights with terror, the constant weight of knowing that failure was not an option. Yet they pressed on, driven by a force greater than fear. The battles they fought were unlike anything mortal eyes had seen. The devs, monstrous and merciless, descended upon villages like a plague, their forms shifting between shadow and flame. They brought ruin wherever they tread, their laughter echoing through the ruins of shattered homes. But the heroes stood firm. They did not possess the immortality of the gods nor the raw power of their adversaries, but they fought with something far greater, the unyielding spirit of humanity. One battle became legend, a clash at the base of a mountain where the skies darkened as if the heavens themselves mourned the carnage below. The devs, led by a towering beast wreathed in fire, surged forward, their numbers vast and their intent clear: annihilation. The heroes, outnumbered and weary, formed a line, their faces grim but their resolve unbroken. Arash raised his hammer, its glow piercing through the smoke, and called out to his companions. They answered, not with words, but with the thunderous beat of their hearts, each one willing to sacrifice everything for the world they loved. The battle raged for hours, each moment an eternity. Arash's hammer fell like a meteor, crushing the earth and scattering the devs like leaves in a storm. Mitra moved through the chaos, her hands aglow as she pulled the wounded from the brink of death, her tears mingling with the blood that stained the ground. Kavi's voice rang out, his words weaving through the battlefield, lifting spirits and striking fear into the hearts of their enemies. It was in this battle that a young boy, barely old enough to hold a blade, found his courage. He had followed the heroes, drawn by the pull of destiny, and now stood trembling amidst the carnage. Arash saw him, his eyes softening even as he swung his hammer in a wide arc. "Stand with us," he said, his voice steady despite the chaos. The boy nodded, his fear melting into determination, and he raised his blade. The tide turned. The devs faltered, their advance slowing as the heroes pushed forward, their unity a force greater than any weapon. The beast that led the devs roared, its fire dimming as it clashed with Arash in a duel that shook the mountain itself. With a final swing, the blacksmith-turned warrior struck the beast down, its body crumbling into ash. The remaining devs fled, their laughter replaced by screams as the heroes claimed victory. In the aftermath, the battlefield was eerily silent. The heroes stood amidst the wreckage, their breaths heavy but their spirits unbroken. The young boy knelt, his blade still clutched in his hands, his eyes wide with awe. Mitra placed a hand on his shoulder, her smile soft and her voice gentle. "You are one of us now." And so, the age of heroes grew. Each victory, no matter how small, became a beacon of hope. Their deeds were sung across the land, their names etched into the memories of those they saved. They were not perfect, they doubted, they feared, they fell, but they rose again, their humanity their greatest strength. In their fight against the devs, they became more than mortals, they became symbols of what the world could be. The gods watched from the heavens, their hearts swelling with pride and sorrow. They knew the heroes' paths would not be easy, that the battles ahead would test them in ways unimaginable. But they also knew that as long as these champions stood, the flame of hope would never be extinguished. The Age of Heroes was not an era of peace, but it was an era of defiance, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit. And as the wind carried their stories across the land, the world dared to believe that even in the darkest of times, there were those who would rise to meet the light. The night the moon bled red, the world held its breath. The sky, once a comforting canopy of stars, turned into an ominous expanse, as though the heavens themselves had been wounded. The moon's crimson light bathed the land in an eerie glow, casting long shadows that danced like specters on the trembling earth. This was no natural phenomenon. It was a harbinger, a sign of a moment that would change the fabric of existence. The gods had always seemed invincible, their power stretching across the cosmos, shaping the fates of mortals and immortals alike. They were the protectors, the creators, the unwavering guardians of balance. But even they could not stop the storm that came with the blood moon. It was the night when the devs, creatures born of chaos and hatred, clawed their way to a terrible triumph. It began with a silence so profound that it felt like the world had ceased to breathe. Rivers halted their flow, winds grew still, and even the forest seemed to shrink under the oppressive weight of what was coming. Then came the tremors. Faint at first, a subtle vibration beneath the feet, they soon grew into a violent shaking that split the ground and toppled mountains. The mortals looked to the skies, their prayers desperate, their voices trembling with fear. But the gods, who had always answered, were nowhere to be seen. The devs emerged from the shadows, their forms shifting between grotesque and terrifyingly beautiful. They were many, their power amplified by the blood moon, their laughter cutting through the silence like shards of glass. Led by Ingramenu, the embodiment of destruction and deceit, they surged forward, tearing through the barriers that had once held them at bay. The celestial battle that followed was unlike anything ever witnessed. The gods, their golden armor gleaming even under the bloodied light, stood firm, their weapons raised. Their voices rang out in ancient chants, the sound reverberating through the cosmos. It was a sight to inspire hope, a radiant defiance against the tide of chaos. But the devs had grown stronger. The blood moon was their weapon, a manifestation of their fury, and it tipped the scales in their favor. For every blow the gods struck, the devs retaliated with a force that shook the heavens. Mountains crumbled, seas churned, and the very fabric of time seemed to waver as the battle raged on. In the heart of the conflict stood Mitra, the god of covenants and light, his spear blazing with a brilliance that pierced the darkness. He fought not just with strength, but with the unwavering belief that justice would prevail. But even Mitra faltered as the devs pressed in, their laughter mocking his efforts. Ungramenu himself descended, his form a swirling void that devoured light, his voice a whisper that could shatter resolve. Even gods can fall, he hissed, his words wrapping around Mitra like chains. It was then that the unthinkable happened. One by one, the gods began to falter. Their golden shields cracked, their radiant forms dimmed, and their voices, once a symphony of power, grew quiet. The devs had found a way to break them, not through strength alone, but through the corruption of the blood moon. It sapped the gods of their divine essence, turning their own power against them. Mortals watched in horror as their protectors fell from the skies, their forms crashing into the earth with a force that sent shockwaves across the land. The light dimmed, and with it, hope began to wane. Villages were swallowed by fire, rivers ran black with ash, and the laughter of the devs echoed across the ruins. Among the fallen was Anahita, the goddess of water and purity. Her once boundless strength had been drained by the blood moon's curse, and her tears turned to streams of silver as she sank to her knees. "Forgive us," she whispered, her voice carried by the winds to the ears of those who still believed in her. It was a moment that would etch itself into the hearts of mortals, a goddess brought low, her light flickering like a dying flame. Yet even in their triumph, the devs were not satisfied. They sought to unmake the world, to twist it into a reflection of their own chaos. The blood moon burned brighter, its light searing the land, leaving scars that would never heal. It was a turning point, not just in the battle, but in the very story of existence. But amidst the despair, something remarkable happened. The mortals, who had always looked to the gods for salvation, began to rise. They stood amidst the ruins, their faces streaked with tears and ash, their hands trembling as they picked up the weapons of their fallen champions. They were not gods. They were not chosen. They were simply human. And yet, they stood. A farmer raised his voice in defiance, his cry a raw, primal sound that cut through the chaos. A mother, cradling her child, lifted her head and met the gaze of a dev with unyielding determination. A child, too young to understand the magnitude of what was happening, clasped their hands together and prayed, not to the gods, but to the strength within themselves. The blood moon had marked a terrible loss, but it also ignited a flame in the hearts of those who remained. They refused to surrender, their resilience a testament to the indomitable spirit of humanity. And though the gods had been brought low, their essence lingered in the hearts of those who still believed. The night of the blood moon would never be forgotten. It was a wound that would scar the world, a reminder of the fragility of even the greatest powers. But it was also a spark, a moment that proved that even in the face of utter darkness, the smallest light could shine. The mortals, battered and broken, looked to the horizon, their eyes reflecting the crimson glow. And as the first rays of dawn began to pierce through the bloodied sky, they knew that this was not the end. It was a beginning, a testament to the resilience of a world that refused to be unmade. In the aftermath of the blood moon, the gods stood among the wreckage, their divine forms battered but unbroken in spirit. The land was scarred, the sky still carried the echo of anguished cries, and the rivers ran heavy with ash and sorrow. The balance of the world teetered on the brink of collapse. It was clear that their strength alone, fractured and vulnerable as it was, would not suffice against the tide of chaos. And so, in the heart of this despair, a decision was made, a pact sealed with the remnants of their divine will. They would craft weapons, not of mortal steel, but of celestial fire and sacred purpose. These would be no ordinary tools of war, they would carry the very essence of the gods, an extension of their divine souls, imbued with power that could pierce the darkness itself. The forge was unlike anything the mortal eye could comprehend. Suspended in a timeless void, it burned with a brilliance that could sear through the soul, its flames fueled by the heart of a dying star. The gods gathered, their faces solemn, their resolve unshaken. Mitra, his radiance dimmed but his spirit unyielding, stepped forward to ignite the flames. His touch set the forge alight, the heat rising in waves that rippled through the void, carrying the sound of his war chants. The first relic to take shape was a sword. It shimmered with the light of 1,000 suns, its edges impossibly sharp, as if forged to cut through the very fabric of reality. Each strike of the hammer echoed with the heartbeat of creation itself. Anahita stood by Mitra's side, her hand steady as she etched runes of purity and protection into the blade. It was not just a weapon, it was a promise, a symbol of hope that no darkness could extinguish. The mortals would call it Vragna, the sun's wrath, and it would become the bane of all that sought to consume the light. But the gods knew that a single sword could not stand alone against the tide. Each deity, drawing from their essence, contributed to the creation of a unique relic, each one born from the core of their being. Tiria, the rainbringer, forged a bow that sang with the song of storms. Its arrows were made of pure lightning, their flight faster than thought, striking with the force of crashing oceans. With every pull of the string, the air crackled, and the heavens seemed to weep for the world it aimed to protect. Vragna, the shape-shifting god of victory, stepped forward to create a shield. Forged in the fires of his indomitable spirit, the shield bore the mark of his 10 forms. It was an impenetrable fortress, capable of withstanding even the mightiest blows from the devs. Yet, it was more than a tool of defense. When wielded with courage, it mirrored the heart of its bearer, turning their determination into an unbreakable barrier. As each relic emerged from the forge, the gods grew quieter, their energy flowing into their creations. These weapons were not merely objects, they were sacrifices. With every strike of the hammer, they gave away a piece of themselves, binding their essence into the relics so that the mortals who bore them would carry the strength of the divine. There was a moment when the forge itself seemed to falter, the flames dimming as though overcome by the weight of the task. It was then that Zervan, the god of infinite time, appeared. His presence was both a blessing and a burden. His hands, ancient and weathered, took hold of the forge's edges, and with a voice that carried the wisdom of countless eras, he whispered, "One more." From the depths of his being, Zervan conjured a hammer. It was simple in form, yet its weight carried the burden of time itself. The hammer's strike could reshape the flow of history, bending it away from chaos. But Zervan hesitated, his gaze lingering on the hammer. To wield it was to take on the responsibility of the past, the present, and the future. And so, with a sigh that seemed to echo through eternity, he placed it within the forge, allowing the other gods to complete its creation. The hammer would become known as Zervanos, the Keeper's Judgment. When the forge's fire finally dimmed, and the last of the relics had been crafted, the gods stood in silence, their gazes fixed upon their creations. These weapons were their legacy, their answer to the darkness that sought to undo everything they had built. They were not merely tools for war, they were symbols of resilience, a testament to the strength that could emerge even in the face of annihilation. The mortals, when the relics were gifted to them, did not immediately understand their magnitude. How could they? They were farmers, shepherds, craftsmen, not warriors, not heroes. Yet, as they held these divine weapons, they felt a stirring deep within their souls. The sword, the bow, the shield, the hammer, they did not merely grant power, they awakened something that had always been there but had been forgotten. They reminded the mortals of their potential, their courage, their unyielding spirit. The devs, when they saw the weapons in the hands of the mortals, laughed. They mocked the gods for placing their trust in such fragile creatures. But their laughter turned to rage when the first of the mortals, a young woman with trembling hands but a fiery heart, struck down a dev with the sun's wrath. It was not just a death, it was a declaration. The era of fear was over, and the tide was beginning to turn. The gods, though weakened, watched from the heavens as the mortals, armed with their sacred creations, began to fight back. For the first time since the blood moon, the devs faltered. The weapons, glowing with divine energy, cut through their darkness, sending them reeling. The mortals, who had once cowered, now stood tall, their voices rising in a chorus of defiance. The creation of the sacred weapons was more than an act of necessity, it was a moment of transformation. The gods had given all they could, and in doing so, they had lit a spark within humanity. The relics were a bridge between the mortal and the divine, a reminder that even in the face of chaos, there was always a way forward. And as the mortals marched to war, their hands gripping the sacred weapons, they carried not just the hope of the gods, but the unyielding strength of their own hearts. The world trembled under a suffocating shadow, its light dimmed to a flicker. chaos raged unchecked, spreading across the lands like a plague. The cries of the innocent, the whispers of the lost, and the roar of destruction mingled into a deafening cacophony. It was a moment when all seemed poised to fall into darkness forever. Amid this turmoil, Spentameinu, the sacred spirit of Ahura Mazda, emerged, a flame of unwavering resolve against the encroaching void. Spentameinu did not come as a conqueror or an avenger. He came as a guardian, burdened by the weight of a world spiraling out of harmony. His task was clear but perilous, to endure 7 trials, each designed to test his essence, and to restore the delicate balance teetering on the edge of ruin. The first trial began in a barren wasteland where nothing grew, and the wind howled like the wails of forgotten souls. Before him loomed a towering figure, its form shifting and writhing, its voice like gravel grinding in the pit of the earth. This was Eshma, the spirit of fury, whose rage consumed everything it touched. Spentameinu stood calm, his presence a soothing balm to the chaos around him. He did not fight fire with fire, but instead let his serenity seep into the land. Slowly, the wind stilled, the earth ceased its trembling, and Eshma, stripped of its power, vanished into the void. But the respite was fleeting. The second trial plunged him into a dark abyss, where the air was thick with despair. Here dwelled Druj, the spirit of deceit, whose whispers could unravel even the strongest mind. Voices echoed in the void, twisting truth into lies, weaving doubt into every corner of his soul. Spentameinu closed his eyes and reached inward, seeking the eternal flame of truth that burned within. The lies faltered against his unshakable clarity, and Druj's illusions dissolved like smoke in the wind. The third trial came in the form of a relentless storm. Lightning clawed at the heavens, and rain fell in torrents that seemed to pierce through the skin. Amid the chaos, the spirit of want and greed, Tiria, appeared, clutching treasures and promises of power. "Take them," it hissed, "and end your suffering." But Spentameinu walked forward, his eyes fixed on the horizon, untempted by the false offerings. The storm raged on but could not touch him. Tiria's treasures turned to ash in its grasp, and it fled into the shadows. Exhausted but undeterred, Spentameinu faced the fourth trial in a forest where the trees whispered ancient fears. Here, the spirit of laziness, Bushiasp, waited, heavy and oppressive like a shroud of indifference. The air grew thick, pulling at his limbs, tempting him to rest, to give in. But Spentameinu stood tall, his resolve a beacon against the suffocating weight. With every step, he breathed life into the forest, and Bushiasp's grip weakened until the trees stood proud and still. The fifth trial brought hunger, a gnawing emptiness that clawed at his essence. Az, the spirit of greed and gluttony, took form, its eyes gleaming with insatiable hunger. It offered him endless sustenance, an escape from the hollow ache within. Spentameinu refused, his will nourished by purpose rather than indulgence. He knelt on the barren ground, planting seeds of his light, and from the earth sprang a garden that banished Az's shadowy figure. The sixth trial was the hardest yet. It led him to a battlefield where countless souls fought in endless strife. The air reeked of blood and smoke, and Arashk, the spirit of discord, reveled in the chaos. It whispered hatred into the hearts of the warriors, turning brother against brother, friend against friend. Spentameinu stepped into the fray, his voice rising above the clamor. He spoke of unity, of shared purpose, and as his words spread, the warriors dropped their weapons, their anger fading like a distant storm. Arashk shrieked and vanished, its power undone. Finally, the seventh trial awaited, a test of his own soul. Standing atop a mountain, Spentameinu faced a mirror that reflected his darkest fears, his deepest regrets. Doubts clawed at him, asking whether his efforts were enough, whether his sacrifices were in vain. For a moment, he wavered, his flame flickering against the weight of his burdens. But then he looked beyond the reflection, beyond the doubts, and saw the faces of those he fought for, the children laughing under the sun, the farmers tilling fertile soil, the rivers running clear and free. His flame roared to life, and the mirror shattered into 1,000 harmless shards. As the final shard fell, the world seemed to exhale. The land softened, the skies cleared, and the balance, fragile yet restored, hummed with quiet harmony. Spintamanu stood, weary but unbroken, his essence forever changed by the trials. He had not merely endured, he had transformed, carrying the scars of his struggle as a reminder of the strength that lies in perseverance and the power of unwavering faith in the face of chaos. The earth was quiet in a way that felt unnatural, as though the very essence of life had dimmed. Once, the voices of gods resonated in the whisper of the wind, the roar of the sea, and the steady hum of the mountains. Now, their presence was a fading echo, a memory slipping through the cracks of time. It wasn't sudden. Their retreat unfolded like a slow unraveling, a withdrawal marked by moments of wonder and heartbreak. They had walked among mortals, luminous and unyielding, shaping the world with their will. Their influence had been woven into every sunrise, every breath of wind, every heartbeat. Mortals had built temples, sung songs, and offered their prayers, believing the gods would remain forever steadfast. But the balance of existence shifted, as it always does. The devotion of humans faltered, their gaze turning inward, distracted by their own creations. The gods, eternal but bound to the belief of those they protected, began to fade. It started with the smaller signs. Rivers once sacred ran dry, their spirits no longer dancing beneath the surface. The stars, once guides and guardians, seemed to dim just slightly, their constellations trembling on the edge of permanence. Mortals, caught in their own struggles, barely noticed. But to those who still listened, still felt, the absence was undeniable. One evening, a shepherd tending his flock on a quiet hilltop looked up to see the sky split open, a cascade of golden light spilling out like liquid fire. From it emerged a procession, figures of ethereal beauty and unyielding strength. They did not walk, they glided, their forms shimmering like dreams made real. At their center was Mitra, the protector of covenants, her gaze heavy with sorrow. Behind her was Anahita, the life-giving waters trailing behind her like a river parting for her path. Their eyes met the shepherd's for a fleeting moment, and in that glance, he felt the weight of 1,000 lifetimes. Then they were gone, ascending into the light, leaving behind a world forever altered. The celestial realms were not distant places, they were spaces born of the gods' own essence, realms that pulsed with their power and memory. To retreat there was not an act of abandonment but of survival, a return to a sanctuary where their fading light might still burn bright. These realms were boundless yet intimate, landscapes formed from the gods' emotions and legacies. For Tiria, the rainbringer, it was an endless sky of rolling storms, each thunderclap a reminder of battles fought and won. For Vragna, the god of victory, it was a land where every step resonated with the triumphant cries of those who believed. In these realms, time moved differently, if it moved at all. The gods, unmoored from the mortal plane, carried the weight of their past with them. They remembered the times when humans had looked to them with unshakable faith, their prayers vibrant threads weaving a tapestry of connection. They remembered standing side by side with mortals, lending their strength in battles against the darkness. And they remembered the first moments of doubt, when the prayers grew fainter, scattered like leaves in a gust of wind. Yet, even in retreat, they watched. From their hidden sanctuaries, they looked down upon the earth, a place they had once shaped with love and fury. They saw the struggles of humanity, the wars, the triumphs, the quiet moments of kindness that lit the darkest nights. They saw mortals rise to fill the void left by their absence, crafting their own destinies, forging their own paths. It was bittersweet, a mix of pride and longing that echoed through the realms like a melody unfinished. Among the gods, some mourned openly, their tears forming rivers in their sanctuaries. Others bore their sorrow in silence, their faces unreadable as they gazed into the expanse of eternity. There were moments when their light flickered, dimmed by the weight of their fading connection to the mortal world. But even in their sorrow, they found purpose. They whispered to the winds, hoping the echoes might reach those who still believed. They etched their stories into the stars, so that even if forgotten, they might still inspire. And though they had retreated, the gods were not gone. Their influence lingered, subtle yet profound. A warrior, in the heat of battle, might feel an unexplainable surge of courage, a gift from Vragna. A farmer, watching the skies for rain, might sense Tiria's presence in the first drop that kissed the earth. These moments were fleeting, but they were enough to remind humanity of something greater, something eternal. In the end, the retreat of the gods was not a surrender. It was a testament to the cycles of existence, to the ebb and flow of belief and power. They retreated not out of weakness, but out of an understanding that their time in the mortal plane had reached its twilight. From their celestial sanctuaries, they became guardians not of the world's present but of its potential, silent witnesses to the unfolding story of creation. And as the gods watched, they carried a hope as vast as the heavens themselves, that one day, when the stars aligned and the world called out, they would return. The flames burned bright, crackling with a life of their own. They weren't just fire, they were sacred, pure, a living connection to the divine. Around the sacred fire, the chants began, voices lifting in unison, steady and unwavering. It wasn't just a prayer, it was a call, a beacon to Ahura Mazda, the wise lord. In that moment, everything felt still, as if time itself paused to listen. But this wasn't the beginning. This was the turning of an era, a transformation as profound as the rising of the sun. Before these chants filled the air, the lands of Persia had sung with countless voices, hymns to Mitra, Tiria, and Anahita, prayers to the winds and the stars, offerings to the earth. The gods had been many, each one a thread in the fabric of life. Their stories were etched in the mountains, their essence carried in the rivers. Then came Zarathustra, a solitary figure standing against the vast expanse of a world teeming with old gods and ancient ways. He stood in the silence of dawn, his heart burning with questions that no mortal or deity had answered. Why did chaos walk hand in hand with creation? Why did suffering weigh so heavily on the shoulders of the innocent? The answers, when they came, were not whispers but a roar. In the vision, he saw a light that consumed everything else, a light so pure, so infinite, it banished the shadows of doubt and despair. And from that light, a voice, Ahura Mazda, the source of all that is good and just. The wise lord spoke of order, of truth, of a cosmic struggle against the darkness embodied by Ingramanyu. It wasn't a war of swords or flames, but of choices, of thoughts, of the soul's endless battle between Asha, the righteous path, and Druj, the deceitful chaos. The words of Zarathustra spread not like a wildfire, but like a seed carried by the wind. At first, they found no soil. The world clung to its gods, its rituals, its comforts. But slowly, quietly, the seed took root. To those weary of the chaos, to those searching for meaning beyond the cycle of offerings and fears, Zarathustra's message was a revelation. The idea that the world was not merely a plaything of capricious gods, but a battlefield where each person had a role, resonated deeply. The old gods watched. The mighty Mitra, the protector of truth and covenants, felt his place shift. He was no longer the sun dominating the sky, but a star in Ahura Mazda's grand design. Anahita, the goddess of waters, found her rivers flowing into new prayers, her essence redefined under the light of Zarathustra's teachings. They were not forgotten, their names still lingered on lips and in hearts. But their roles changed, diminished in the wake of the monotheistic light that now shone over the land. As Zoroastrianism spread, its fire temples became beacons across the empire. The flames within them burned as symbols of purity, a constant reminder of Ahura Mazda's presence. The faithful gathered around, their prayers no longer scattered among countless gods, but directed to one. It was unity, simple, profound, and transformative. But this transformation wasn't without struggle. The old ways clung tightly, unwilling to let go. There were priests who whispered in the shadows, their voices trembling with anger and fear, declaring Zarathustra's vision a betrayal. There were those who saw the eclipse of their gods as a theft, a loss that struck at the very core of their identity. And there was sorrow, too. In the quiet moments, when the new chants subsided, the echoes of the old prayers could still be heard, ghostly hymns to a pantheon slowly slipping into memory. The shepherd who once called to Tiria for rain now found himself standing before a fire, his lips forming new words, but his heart aching with the weight of what was left behind. Yet Zoroastrianism offered something the old ways did not: hope. It spoke of a savior, Seoshyant, who would come to restore balance, to vanquish the darkness that plagued creation. It gave mortals a purpose that reached beyond survival, beyond mere offerings. It told them that their choices mattered, that every thought and action was a step in the cosmic dance of light and dark. As the Persian Empire grew, Zoroastrianism became its heart, its soul. Kings carried its teachings into their courts, its flames lighting the palaces of Persepolis. The empire itself seemed to mirror the religion, a force of order, of unity, striving to bring harmony to the lands under its rule. But the gods of old were not so easily erased. They lingered in the shadows of mountains, in the whispers of the wind. They were there in the superstitions that clung to daily life, in the moments of fear when a storm raged or a drought threatened. They were there in the stories passed down in secret, tales of battles fought by Mitra, of rivers blessed by Anahita. In those hidden places, the gods watched the rise of Zoroastrianism with a mix of awe and melancholy. They were not defeated, they were transformed. They became part of a larger story, woven into the tapestry of a world now defined by Ahura Mazda's light. Their essence, their power, was still there, flowing beneath the surface, waiting for those who remembered. And so, the world shifted. The old ways faded, but they left behind a foundation upon which the new was built. The gods and their stories became the roots of a tree that now stretched toward the heavens, its branches reaching out in every direction, its leaves touched by the fire of Ahura Mazda. The air was heavy, carrying the scent of burning incense mixed with an undercurrent of something more foreboding, loss, perhaps. The temple, once alive with offerings, laughter, and whispered prayers, now stood hollow, its sacred fires extinguished. Echoes of the past lingered in the vast emptiness, the kind of silence that spoke of gods once worshipped but now forgotten. The statues, weathered by time and abandonment, stared into nothingness, their expressions carved in eternal vigilance, betrayed by those who once knelt before them. It wasn't a sudden fall. Power rarely collapses in an instant, it fades, chipped away piece by piece. These gods, mighty once, had shaped the mountains, governed the rivers, and whispered through the winds. Their presence was undeniable, their stories intertwined with the lives of mortals who trusted in their strength. But the world had shifted, as it always does, drawn by forces beyond the comprehension of gods and men alike. There were whispers in the courts and across the bazaars. Kings, now favoring one god above all, sought order where chaos had reigned. No longer would the heavens be a battlefield of competing deities. Ahura Mazda stood at the pinnacle, a beacon of monotheistic clarity in an empire eager to consolidate power. The gods of old, with their vibrant, conflicting domains, were seen as relics of a bygone time, symbols of division, not unity. Mitra, the god of covenants and oaths, who had once stood as the mediator of truth, found his sacred altars abandoned. The sun still rose each day, but it did so under the watchful eyes of another. His light, though undimmed, no longer inspired offerings or hymns. Tiria, the bringer of rains, whose battles against drought had once been immortalized in song, was reduced to a name spoken only in passing, a memory clinging to the edges of forgotten prayers. And then there was Anahita, the radiant goddess of waters, fertility, and purity. Her rivers still flowed, carving life into the arid lands of Persia, but her temples stood empty, her devotees scattered. Her name lived on in whispers, in the sighs of those who remembered her blessings, yet it was no longer shouted in joy or reverence. The waters carried her sorrow, an eternal mourning for a world that had moved on. It wasn't only religion that turned the tide. Politics wove its own relentless threads into the unraveling of the pantheon. Kings sought stability, and with it, the gods who had once demanded loyalty were seen as rivals to the centralized power of state and ruler. A single faith was easier to control, easier to wield as a unifying force across an empire so vast that it stretched beyond the edges of maps. And so, one by one, the gods were stripped of their altars, their priests silenced, their sacred symbols erased. Yet the gods did not leave quietly. The earth trembled beneath their fading presence. Storms raged, rivers swelled, and the skies seemed darker, as if the elements themselves mourned their departure. To the faithful who still clung to the old ways, these were not mere coincidences, but cries of anguish, the gods railing against their exile. But their rebellion was short-lived. The new order was too strong, its roots too deep. The old gods became stories, tales to be told by firelight. Parents whispered their names to wide-eyed children, the myths softened by time and stripped of their once mighty reverence. Mitra was no longer a god of truth, but a figure of folklore, a distant hero who fought valiantly in a world of chaos. Anahita's rivers became places of legend, her presence felt in the cool waters, but her name forgotten. For those who remembered, the loss was unbearable. The farmers who once prayed to Tiria as they tilled the dry earth now turned to the singular light of Ahura Mazda, but in their hearts, they still wondered if the rains answered the cries of an unseen god. The warriors who once swore by Mitra's name before charging into battle now called out to a new divine, though the echo of the old oaths still lingered in their ears. And the mothers who once sang Anahita's blessings over their newborns still felt her touch in the quiet moments, though they no longer dared to call it by name. The banishment wasn't total, it never could be. The gods had woven themselves too deeply into the fabric of life to be entirely forgotten. Their symbols were hidden, their stories disguised. A crescent moon here, a flowing river there, a sunlit peak that seemed to radiate something ancient and eternal. They were there, in the shadows and the whispers, waiting for those who still believed. But for the pantheon, this was no longer their world. Their power waned, their voices silenced. They became watchers, not actors, relegated to the periphery of existence. And yet, they endured, not as gods commanding the heavens, but as echoes, as dreams, as fragments of a time when the divine and the mortal walked hand in hand. Their fall wasn't the end, it was a transformation. They became the pulse beneath the surface, the quiet heartbeat of a land that remembered even when its people forgot. In the ruins of their temples, flowers bloomed, stubborn and wild, as if nature itself refused to let them vanish completely. Their myths were carried on the winds, spoken in secret, sung in defiance, written into the very soul of the land they once ruled. Though the pantheon was banished, their legacy refused to be extinguished. They lived on in the hearts of those who couldn't forget, in the stories told to children who didn't yet know their names, and in the whispers of the earth that seemed to call out, over and over, to those willing to listen. The winds of change swept across the land like a quiet storm, unnoticed at first, but soon impossible to ignore. The gods who once stood proudly at the center of Persian life, those mighty beings whose names echoed through every prayer and sacrifice, were now slipping through the cracks of history. As civilizations grew, blending and intertwining with one another, something strange and haunting happened. The gods of ancient Persia did not die, they were transformed. The stories of these gods, once vivid with the colors of their divine powers, began to fade, not into oblivion, but into the shadows of foreign lands. Their shapes twisted, their identities shifted like sand dunes swept away by the wind, altered by the touch of new cultures. The names that once stood as pillars of ancient belief became faint whispers in the languages of distant peoples. No longer were they the gods of the mountains, rivers, and skies. Instead, they were borrowed, reshaped, and worn like the clothes of another. Mitra, the god of light and covenant, whose name once commanded the loyalty of kings and warriors, found himself adrift in foreign lands. The Romans, with their insatiable thirst for gods to worship, took him in. They wrapped him in their own symbolism, elevating him to a role that was both familiar and strange. He became the god of the sun, but not quite the same. The rituals and prayers that once hailed him as the mediator of truth and justice were now cloaked in the mystery of Roman traditions. And as Mitra's light dimmed in Persia, it burned brighter in Rome, but it was no longer his own. It was as if the flame had been stolen, carried across oceans and mountains, and reshaped into something foreign, something new. He wasn't forgotten, he was remade. Anahita, the radiant goddess of waters, fertility, and purity, saw her image flicker like a candle flame in the hands of distant cultures. She was no longer the goddess who birthed the rivers and filled the seas. In the hearts of the Greeks, she morphed into Aphrodite, the goddess of love. The rivers that once roared with her power now murmured with the whisper of romance, as if her essence had been diluted, her purity tainted by the desires of men. The old myths where she commanded the tides and cleansed the earth in her waters were lost, replaced by tales of beauty and longing. But deep within the remnants of the myth, something of Anahita remained, a distant echo of the goddess she once was. Even Tiria, the god of the rains, who fought tirelessly against the drought demons to bring life-giving water to the parched lands, was not spared. The world beyond Persia saw him not as the great warrior who defended the crops and the farmers, but as a spirit of abundance, a symbol of the seasons. The gods of fertility and harvests took his place, his essence diluted by new faces. Tiria was no longer the hero who soared across the skies, commanding the rains, but a forgotten shadow of a rain god whose story was reduced to a fragment of something more familiar. It was not just the gods who were swallowed by foreign traditions. Their myths, too, were transformed. They slipped into the folklore of neighboring peoples, altered like water flowing through different lands. The gods became symbols of broader, less specific beliefs, ideas of order, justice, and love that transcended the boundaries of their original stories. They were assimilated into a new tapestry, their vibrant personalities smoothed over to fit the new cultures that welcomed them. But in this transformation, something was lost. The fierce battles of Tiria against the demons, the purity of Anahita's waters, the sacred covenants of Mitra, all these stories were diluted. The gods no longer stood in their full glory, they had been adapted to fit the mold of other gods, made more palatable, easier to grasp for people who had never known them. The cultural exchange that once brought knowledge and understanding instead became a soft erasure, a fading of the divine in favor of new, louder voices. And yet, there was beauty in the way the gods were reshaped, even if it was painful to witness. The fire that once burned brightly in Persia now flickered in the far corners of the world, lighting the hearts of those who still believed in the power of the divine. Even though Mitra was no longer the same god, he still held a place in the hearts of those who remembered, even if they only remembered the name. The same was true for Anahita, for Tiria, and for all the forgotten gods who had been altered by time and culture. Their essence still lingered in the air, like the scent of a long-forgotten flower, buried beneath the dust of time. For those who had seen the gods in their original form, the transformation was bittersweet. The stories of their childhood, the gods they had worshipped, now seemed like something from a dream that had been shared by many but now seemed distant, something that belonged to another world. The gods had not truly died, they had simply become something else. Something new. The world moved on, as it always does, and the gods were left to fade into the shadows. But in those shadows, they whispered. Their stories, though altered, still found their way into the hearts of those who were willing to listen. And in the silence of the night, when the wind rustled through the trees or the stars blinked high above, one could almost hear the faint echo of their names, still carrying the power of the past, still alive in the myths that had been hidden away in the folds of history. The gods were not gone. They were simply transformed. And in the hearts of those who remembered, they would never be forgotten. The air hung heavy with an eerie stillness, as if the ruins themselves held their breath, guarding secrets too sacred for the living. In the crumbling remains of Anahita's temples, silence reigned. Stones that once echoed with prayers of devotion now lay scattered, their jagged edges softened by centuries of wear. Moss crept across the carved pillars, and weeds wove their roots through cracks, but the presence of something greater lingered, a force that neither time nor neglect could erase. The temple walls, though fractured, still bore the faint traces of Anahita's story. Intricate carvings of flowing rivers and celestial symbols told of her dominion over water, fertility, and purity. Once bright with pigments that gleamed in the sunlight, these images now seemed ghostly, their meaning slowly fading as the years wore on. And yet, standing amidst the ruins, there was no doubt that this was a place of immense power. It felt as if the goddess herself had stepped away for only a moment, leaving behind the faintest imprint of her divine essence. A forgotten pool lay at the heart of one such sanctuary, its waters still and dark, reflecting the sky like a mirror. This pool had once been a sacred spring, fed by underground streams said to be blessed by Anahita herself. Pilgrims would have knelt here, their hands trembling as they cupped the holy water, praying for her favor. Now, the water was shadowed by the weight of abandonment, yet it glimmered faintly, as if defying the decay around it. It was impossible to gaze into it without feeling a pull, a quiet longing for the purity it had once promised. The air within these ruins carried whispers, soft and fragmented, as though the stones themselves were trying to speak. To anyone who lingered, it was clear these sanctuaries had not simply been places of worship, they had been places of solace, where hearts burdened with sorrow could find peace. In their prime, the temples of Anahita had drawn pilgrims from across the land, farmers pleading for rain, lovers seeking her blessing, mothers hoping for the health of their children. Now, all that remained were echoes of those prayers, faint and fragile as spider silk. Walking through the ruins, one could feel the weight of loss pressing against the skin, the ache of something once grand reduced to rubble. These sanctuaries had not fallen to mere neglect, they had been forgotten, their significance erased by the march of time and changing beliefs. What had driven worshippers away? Was it the rise of new gods, new powers, or simply the slow erosion of faith? The temples themselves seemed to ask these questions, their gaping doorways like open mouths, their silence a demand for answers. An ancient statue of Anahita still stood in one corner of the ruins, though it was weathered and chipped. Her serene face was marred by cracks, and her flowing robes were barely discernible, but there was strength in her stance. She seemed to stand guard over the ruins, her gaze unyielding despite the centuries that had passed. Once, this statue had been adorned with offerings, garlands of flowers, bowls of fresh water, and coins glinting in the sunlight. Now, it was bare, save for the occasional bird that rested on her shoulder, as if keeping her company. And yet, even in abandonment, these temples had not lost their sacredness. There was a defiance in their ruins, a quiet resistance to being erased entirely. The wind that rustled through the broken columns seemed to hum a melody, a song of the goddess who had once dwelled here. Visitors, rare as they were, could not help but feel humbled in the presence of these forgotten sanctuaries. The ruins seemed to ask them to remember, not just Anahita, but the reverence and hope she had inspired in those who believed. Stories lingered about the sanctuaries, passed down in whispers. Some said that on moonlit nights, the ruins came alive, bathed in a silvery glow as if the goddess herself returned to walk among them. Others spoke of the pool at the heart of the sanctuary, claiming it still held miraculous powers for those pure of heart. Pilgrims, though few, sometimes made their way to these ruins, leaving behind small tokens, a single flower, a handful of seeds, or a whispered prayer. These offerings, though meager, seemed to rekindle the spirit of the place, if only for a moment. The ruins also carried a sense of warning, a reminder of the fragility of devotion. Once, these temples had stood as symbols of human connection to the divine, yet they had been abandoned. Did the goddess turn her back on her people, or had her people turned their backs on her? The ruins seemed to challenge anyone who came upon them to consider what they worshipped and why. Faith, they seemed to say, was as fleeting as it was powerful. Even in their broken state, these sanctuaries held an undeniable beauty. The interplay of light and shadow through their collapsed roofs created patterns that seemed almost deliberate, as if Anahita's hand still guided the sun's rays. Birds and insects flitted about, their movements weaving life back into the stones. Nature had reclaimed these spaces, but it had done so gently, with a reverence that suggested even it understood the sanctity of what once stood here. In the end, the ruins of Anahita's temples were not just reminders of a forgotten past, they were testaments to the enduring spirit of belief. They stood not as monuments to the goddess alone, but to the human need for something greater, something to turn to when the weight of existence grew too heavy. And though the world had moved on, leaving these temples to crumble, the essence of what they represented remained, quiet, persistent, and waiting to be remembered. In the stillness of the night, where shadows stretched long and the world seemed to pause, faint flickers of light would appear, hidden flames, dancing as if to a rhythm only they could hear. These were no ordinary fires. They were whispers in the darkness, fragile yet defiant, carrying a legacy that refused to be extinguished. Beneath cloaked skies, in forgotten caves, or within the hollowed ruins of abandoned temples, the whispering flames burned, their warmth protecting a faith the world had forsaken. The gatherings were a secret, known only to those bound by an unspoken loyalty to gods whose names had all but faded from history. Men and women, their faces shadowed by hoods and secrecy, would assemble in hushed silence. They came not for rebellion, but for remembrance. They lit their fires as acts of devotion, offering prayers to deities no longer recognized by the world above. Each spark was a plea, each flame a cry against the tide of orthodoxy that sought to erase what they cherished. The rituals varied from place to place, shaped by memory and the scarcity of what had been preserved. Some brought offerings, an earthen bowl filled with fragrant oils, a handful of herbs crushed to release their scent, or small carvings meant to honor the forgotten gods. Others sang songs in whispered tones, their melodies trembling with both reverence and fear. The air would grow heavy with smoke and emotion, and it seemed as if the gods themselves leaned closer, drawn by the sheer force of belief. Every gathering carried a risk. The orthodoxy above, unyielding and all-seeing, had little tolerance for defiance. The penalty for clinging to the old ways was not mere scorn but often death. Yet, the worshippers persisted, their faith too deeply rooted to abandon. They believed the gods were still watching, still listening, and to turn away now would be the ultimate betrayal. For them, the flames were more than light, they were hope. Fragile, flickering hope, but hope nonetheless. The leaders of these secret gatherings, often called keepers, bore the heaviest burden. They were the keepers of stories, protectors of sacred texts, and bearers of ancient wisdom. In their minds, the tales of the gods were not myths, but truths that deserved to endure. Some keepers were descendants of temple priests, carrying knowledge passed down through whispers and dreams. Others had stumbled upon the faith in forgotten manuscripts or during moments of personal revelation. Whatever their path, they became the heart of these gatherings, their voices steady and unwavering as they led prayers to a pantheon many believed to be lost. One such keeper, a woman known only as Darva, had turned her modest home into a sanctuary. Beneath her floorboards, a hidden chamber housed the relics of a faith she vowed to protect. A bronze statue of a forgotten goddess, her face serene and eyes cast downward, stood at the center of the room. Around her lay candles and bowls filled with offerings. Darva would light the candles one by one, murmuring prayers that seemed to carry an ancient power. Her followers, faces illuminated by the soft glow, would kneel and listen, their breaths shallow with reverence. Darva's voice, though quiet, carried the weight of ages. She spoke of gods who once walked among mortals, their blessings shaping the world. She told of Anahita, whose waters cleansed the impure, and Mitra, who guarded the bonds of truth and friendship. Her words painted vivid images of a time when the divine was not distant but near, intertwined with every breath and every step. And as she spoke, it felt as though the room itself trembled, as if the gods stirred within the shadows, moved by her devotion. But these moments of connection were fleeting, quickly replaced by the reality of danger. The orthodoxy's agents were relentless, their eyes always watching, their ears always listening. Stories abounded of gatherings interrupted by soldiers, flames snuffed out by force, and believers dragged away into the night. Those who survived whispered of betrayal, of someone breaking under pressure and revealing the sanctuary's hidden locations. Fear ran deep among the faithful, yet it was never enough to quench their resolve. There was a legend whispered among the secret gatherings, a tale of a sacred flame that could never be extinguished. It was said to burn in a hidden sanctuary, protected by the gods themselves. Some believed this flame was the very essence of divine power, while others thought it was a symbol, a reminder that faith could endure anything. Whatever its true nature, the legend gave strength to those who heard it. They would speak of it in hushed tones, their voices trembling with both fear and hope. As long as the flame burns, they would say, the gods have not abandoned us. The children of these gatherings were perhaps the most heartbreaking of all. Too young to understand the gravity of their parents' actions, they would watch the flames with wide, curious eyes. For them, the rituals were both mysterious and comforting, a connection to something larger than themselves. They would sit close to their mothers, their small hands clutching tokens of faith, a carved figurine, a simple thread tied around their wrist. These children were the future of the old faith, and their innocence only made the stakes higher. As the flames whispered and the night wore on, there was a sense of unity among the worshippers. They were not merely individuals clinging to a forgotten faith, they were a family, bound by shared belief and shared risk. In the warmth of the hidden fire, they found solace. In the stories of their gods, they found purpose. And in each other, they found strength to face whatever trials lay ahead. The flames continued to burn, their light casting flickering shadows on the walls. To the untrained eye, these were ordinary shadows, but to the faithful, they held something more. They moved with a rhythm that seemed almost alive, as if the gods themselves danced within the firelight. For those gathered, it was enough. They would leave before dawn, scattering like ashes on the wind, but their faith would remain, carried in their hearts and in the whispered flames that refused to be silenced. The wind swept across the endless dunes, carrying whispers of a homeland left behind. Among the caravan's many treasures, silks shimmering like water, spices sharp enough to sting the air, and jewels glowing with forbidden fire, there were also stories. Stories carried not in satchels or crates, but in hearts and tongues. Tales that had survived war and exile, now woven into the lives of those who moved ever eastward, away from Persia's heart. Fathers and mothers spoke softly to their children as they walked. They told of Ahura Mazda, the light that illuminated all things, and Ingramenu, the shadow that sought to snuff it out. They spoke of Anahita's rivers that blessed the land and of Mitra, who bound oaths as tightly as the threads of a tapestry. The children listened, wide-eyed, the harshness of the journey momentarily forgotten as they imagined gods walking among mortals, shaping destinies with a single word or gesture. The Silk Road, ancient and sprawling, became a corridor not just for goods, but for dreams and faith. Every stop along the way, bustling oases, crowded bazaars, and lonely outposts, echoed with the voices of Persian migrants. Merchants haggled over the price of brocade while, in the shadows, stories were exchanged like currency. A fable here, a myth there, each retelling shifting like sand in the wind, altered yet always recognizable. A lone storyteller would sit by the fire at night, his voice rising and falling like the flames. Once, he would begin, the skies were ruled by gods who danced among the stars. They watched over us, protected us. But when we forgot them, they faded, and now the darkness grows. Faces around him would lean closer, drawn not just by the warmth of the fire, but by the pull of something deeper, a longing to believe that their struggles were part of something grander, something eternal. The myths of Persia flowed into the cultures they touched, sometimes merging, sometimes clashing, always leaving an imprint. In India, the image of Mitra transformed, blending with ancient Vedic deities. In China, whispers of Zoroastrian fire temples echoed in legends of eternal flames, and in the steppes, nomadic tribes wove Anahita's grace into their prayers for water and fertility. For some, the old gods were more than tales, they were companions on an uncertain path. A merchant woman, her arms laden with bolts of cloth, would glance skyward and murmur a prayer to Anahita before crossing a treacherous river. A caravan guard, his sword worn from countless skirmishes, would carve the Faravahar into the hilt of his blade, a silent promise to protect not just his life but his soul. But faith was not always a comfort. For many, it was a wound, raw and bleeding, torn open by the loss of a homeland where temples had once stood proud and fires had burned without fear. In their new lives, these exiles faced gods who were unfamiliar, alien. How could they bow to figures who did not speak their tongue, who did not know their struggles? Yet, over time, they learned to see their own gods reflected in foreign faces. In every act of kindness, they saw traces of Ahura Mazda. In every struggle against injustice, they saw Mitra's unwavering blade. The Silk Road was a place of exchange, but it was also a place of transformation. Just as Persian myths shaped the cultures they touched, they too were shaped in return. A trader might hear a Buddhist monk speak of enlightenment and think of Ahura Mazda's light, while a nomad might weave stories of Ingramenu into his warnings about the dangers of greed and ambition. Slowly, subtly, the old stories shifted, their edges softened, their meanings deepened. There were moments of wonder, fleeting and rare, where the sacred seemed to break through the mundane. In the heat of the desert, a caravan would come upon a spring, its water clear and cool, and someone would whisper, "Anahita has blessed us." In the high mountains, under a sky so crowded with stars it seemed ready to burst, a solitary traveler would light a small fire and feel, for just a moment, that the gods were watching. But there was also sorrow, the kind that lingered in the heart long after the tears had dried. A child born far from Persia would hear the stories of their ancestors and feel a pang of loss for a home they had never known. An old man, his beard streaked with gray, would sit by the roadside and wonder if the gods remembered him, or if they, too, had moved on. And yet, amidst the grief and the longing, there was resilience. The migrants did not merely carry their myths, they lived them. Every act of kindness, every moment of courage, was an echo of the divine stories they cherished. The gods might have seemed distant, but their spirit burned brightly in the hearts of those who remembered. In the end, the Persian myths were not lost. They were scattered like seeds, carried by the wind to places far from their origins. They took root in foreign soil, growing into forms that were new yet familiar. And though the migrants themselves might not live to see it, their faith endured, whispered in markets, sung in temples, and written in the stars above the Silk Road. Beneath the domes of ancient Persian palaces, where light filtered through intricate stained glass and painted mosaics, there was a whisper of something eternal. In the carved stone and flowing verses of poets long gone, the gods lived on, not as they once were, commanding thunder and flame, but as echoes, woven into the fabric of creation itself. A poet stood on a windswept hill, his heart heavy with the weight of unspoken truths. He gazed at the horizon, where the sun dipped low, its golden rays casting long shadows across the earth. With every stroke of his pen, he poured out his longing, his verses speaking of the boundless heavens and a divine justice that burned as fiercely as the sun. Was it Ahura Mazda he invoked, though his words never named the god? Perhaps he didn't need to. In every line, there was light, a light that defied the darkness and promised a return to balance. The old gods had not vanished, they had become something else. They had seeped into the ornate arches of Persian architecture, where symmetry mirrored cosmic order, and every curve and line seemed to hum with quiet divinity. They had slipped into the folds of painted silk, their stories carried in the vibrant reds of battle and the soothing blues of sacred rivers. They had found their way into the floral motifs of Persian carpets, each petal and vine a silent hymn to the cycles of life and renewal. A sculptor worked late into the night, his hands raw and calloused. By the flickering light of an oil lamp, he chiseled a relief onto a temple wall. Though the temple was dedicated to a ruler, not a god, his art told a different story. Hidden among the depictions of kings and warriors were subtle signs, the Faravahar symbol tucked discreetly into a corner, or the flowing robes of a figure that resembled Mitra more than any mortal king. He smiled to himself, a quiet act of defiance and devotion. Even if no one else saw the gods in his work, he knew they were there. In the bustling bazaars, merchants sold ceramics adorned with intricate designs. To the untrained eye, they were merely beautiful patterns, but to those who knew, they were maps of the heavens, each star and swirl a tribute to divine order. Musicians played in the background, their melodies haunting and sweet. The notes rose and fell like a prayer, calling to something ancient and unseen. The gods had become part of the rhythm of life itself, their presence felt in every brushstroke, every word, every note. Persian literature carried the weight of the divine in every stanza, even when the gods were not named. Ferdowsi's Shahnameh, a masterpiece of epic poetry, spoke of heroes and kings, but beneath its surface, the presence of the old faith lingered. The eternal struggle between good and evil, light and dark, echoed the cosmic battle of Ahura Mazda and Ingramenyu. In the tales of bravery and sacrifice, there was a shadow of Mitra's unwavering loyalty and Anahita's nurturing grace. Artists and poets were not the only ones to remember. Common people, too, found ways to keep the gods alive. A woman might embroider a pattern into her veil, the design a silent prayer to Anahita for protection and fertility. A mason might shape a cornerstone with a precision that honored the divine order. Even in the simplest acts, the gods remained, hidden yet present, as enduring as the mountains and as fleeting as a whisper. The architecture of ancient Persia bore testimony to this hidden reverence. Towers of silence stood on hilltops, stark and solemn against the sky. Once places where the dead were returned to the elements, these structures now stood as reminders of a time when the heavens and earth were bound together by sacred purpose. Even centuries later, the ruins retained an aura of mystery, as if the wind itself carried the voices of the past. In the gardens of Persia, the gods' influence was perhaps the most poignant. Designed to mimic paradise, these gardens were a celebration of life, growth, and harmony. Water flowed in carefully constructed channels, its sound hymn to Anahita. Trees stood in perfect symmetry, their roots reaching deep into the earth as their branches reached for the sky, a living symbol of the balance between mortal and divine. But it was in the shadows, and the places where light met darkness, that the gods seemed closest. A forgotten shrine, its carvings worn smooth by time, still bore traces of prayers once whispered there. A tattered manuscript, its ink faded, told of cosmic battles and divine love. Even in ruins, the gods endured, their essence too powerful to be erased. As Persia changed, as new faiths rose and old ways faded, the gods adapted. They hid in plain sight, their symbols and stories woven into new forms. A crescent moon in Islamic art carried echoes of Anahita's grace. The fire that burned in Zoroastrian temples became a metaphor for the eternal spirit. Even when their names were forgotten, their presence could be felt in the beauty and harmony of Persian culture. The gods had once walked the earth, their footsteps shaping mountains and rivers, their voices commanding the skies. Now, they lived in the hearts of the people, in the art and literature that defied the passage of time. They were no longer just gods, they were symbols, ideas, a part of something greater than themselves. A painter stood before a blank canvas, her hands trembling. She dipped her brush into a pool of gold and began to paint the sun. She didn't know why, but as the sun took shape, she felt a warmth, a presence, as if she were not alone. The old gods, it seemed, were still watching. The air was thick with an otherworldly stillness, as if the entire world held its breath. A dim, flickering light cut through the darkness, emanating from a solitary torch. In its glow stood a figure cloaked in tattered robes, their eyes shadowed yet burning with a light that seemed too ancient for mortal years. The Oracle. Some said they were the last, the final voice of a fading divine era. Others dismissed them as a mad wanderer, clinging to myths no longer needed. But when the oracle spoke, even the most skeptical fell silent. Their voice was soft, almost a whisper, but it carried the weight of ages. "Do you hear them?" they asked, their gaze piercing yet mournful. "Do you hear their last lament?" No one answered. They didn't have to. Something about the question tugged at the heart, stirring emotions buried too deep to name. It was said that the oracle had once been an ordinary soul, a child born beneath an eclipsed sun. They grew up like any other, their hands hardened by work, their voice lost in the clamor of life. But one day, they disappeared into the mountains where the gods were thought to have walked. When they returned, years later, they were changed. They spoke of voices carried on the wind, of words carved into stone by hands unseen. "They spoke to me," the oracle would say, their voice trembling with equal parts awe and sorrow. "They told me of their final hour." There was a tale the oracle often repeated, though its meaning was elusive. It spoke of a vast plain shrouded in twilight, where the gods gathered for the last time. The heavens trembled, and the earth wept, but the gods were silent, their gazes fixed on the horizon as if waiting for something, or someone, they knew would never come. And then, one by one, they faded, their forms dissolving into light. All that remained was a single word, left hovering in the air, spoken by a voice that seemed to belong to all of them and none of them at once. The oracle never revealed that word, though many begged to hear it. "It is not for mortal ears," they would say, their eyes distant. To speak it would be to extinguish its meaning. For those who sought the oracle, the journey was as much a test as the answer they sought. The path to their sanctuary was treacherous, winding through jagged cliffs and forests heavy with mist. Some turned back, unwilling to face the whispers that seemed to emanate from the rocks and trees. Others pressed on, driven by questions too urgent to ignore. When they finally reached the oracle, they often found themselves unable to speak, their questions swallowed by the weight of the oracle's presence. One seeker, a young woman with fire in her eyes, dared to ask, "Why did they leave us? Were we not enough?" The oracle's expression softened, their voice a thread of melancholy. They did not leave because they ceased to care, they said. They left because they cared too much. To remain was to risk becoming something they were not. Another, an old man whose hands shook with age, asked, "Will they ever return?" The oracle paused, their silence more telling than any words. "Their return is not for us to decide," they said at last. "But their essence lingers in all things. In the sun's warmth, in the river's song, in the courage of a heart that refuses to yield. They are gone, and yet they are here." The oracle themselves seemed burdened by the weight of their knowledge. Their nights were restless, haunted by visions they could never fully explain. They often spoke of a fire that burned in the distance, its flames neither consuming nor fading. "It is the memory of them," they said. "It will never die, though it may grow dim." In moments of quiet, when no seekers came, the oracle would sit by the edge of a cliff, their gaze fixed on the stars. They would hum a tune, soft and mournful, said to be the song the gods sang as they departed. Those who overheard it claimed it stirred something primal, something that felt like both a wound and its healing. Despite their sorrow, there was a strange peace about the oracle. They seemed to understand something the rest of the world could not, a truth that defied words but pulsed like a heartbeat in the silence. When pressed, they would say only, "The gods were never truly ours to keep. They were a gift, a reminder of what we could become." One stormy night, when the wind howled like a beast and lightning split the sky, the oracle was seen standing on the highest peak, their arms raised as if embracing the storm. Some claimed they were speaking to the gods, begging them to return. Others believed they were bidding them farewell. Whatever the truth, when dawn broke, the oracle was gone. Their disappearance sparked as many rumors as their existence. Some said they had ascended, joining the gods in their hidden realms. Others believed they had simply walked away, their purpose fulfilled. But those who had stood before the oracle, who had heard their words and felt their presence, carried a piece of them forever. And though the oracle was gone, their voice remained. In the quiet moments, when the world seemed too heavy to bear, people would hear it, a whisper on the wind, a flicker of light, a warmth that felt like an embrace. It reminded them that even in the gods' absence, something of them remained, alive in the hearts of those who dared to remember. On quiet nights when the moon shone silver and the air carried the faint scent of jasmine, whispers of another world danced through the minds of those who dared to dream. These dreams weren't ordinary, they were vivid, filled with beings too grand and too ancient to belong to this earth. A towering figure with flames for eyes, a river goddess adorned with pearls of mist, a shadowed warrior who moved like the wind, these fragments lingered in the hearts of the dreamers, impossible to forget yet hard to explain. Few realized that these were more than dreams. They were echoes, memories of a time when gods walked the land, their presence so entwined with existence that even their fading could not erase them completely. Instead, they slipped into the fabric of everyday life, hidden in the folds of stories told by firelight and the superstitions that shaped how people lived. In small villages, where modernity's grasp was weaker, the elders often spoke of the beings who guarded the unseen. A simple act, like leaving a bowl of milk by the doorstep, was not just an old custom, it was an offering to the spirit of the hearth, one said to be descended from the benevolent deities of old. To refuse such gestures, it was warned, could bring bad luck or even invite calamity. But the stories never painted these beings as malicious. They were protectors, remnants of the gods who still cared for their mortal children in small, quiet ways. Then there were the shadowy figures, the ones spoken of in hushed tones. These weren't the gods of light and creation, but neither were they entirely evil. They were watchers, caught between worlds, often misunderstood. In the flicker of a dying candle, they could be glimpsed for a moment, a shiver down the spine, a fleeting shape in the corner of the eye. Children were told to never mock the dark, for it had ears and remembered insults. The stories didn't inspire fear so much as awe, a reminder that even the most ordinary moments could be touched by the extraordinary. In the mountains, where the air was thin and the stars seemed close enough to touch, shepherds spoke of celestial visitors. They told of nights when the wind carried songs instead of its usual howl, melodies so haunting they felt like a blessing and a warning all at once. The shepherds believed these were the voices of the gods who had once governed the skies, their music now scattered like stardust. Some claimed that if you listened closely enough, you could hear the name of a forgotten deity hidden in the notes, though none dared to repeat it aloud. Even the earth bore marks of the gods' lingering presence. Springs that bubbled with inexplicable warmth in the dead of winter were said to be gifts from Anahita, the water goddess. Travelers left coins or small trinkets at these sites, not out of obligation, but because they felt the presence of something greater. And when those springs dried up, people mourned as though they had lost an old friend. Folklore preserved what history tried to erase. Tales of the trickster god, who could shapeshift into animals to teach mortals lessons, were told to children as both warnings and entertainments. They laughed at the god's mischief but remembered the morals hidden in each story. The trickster was not just a character, they were a reminder of the unpredictable nature of life, of how the divine could be playful and wise all at once. Some traditions grew from these myths in ways so subtle that people didn't even realize their origins. The practice of tying ribbons to trees for good fortune was said to honor a god of the forest, one who now existed only as a faint memory in the rustling of leaves. And when families lit a candle for a safe journey, they were unknowingly invoking a protective deity whose name had been lost, but whose essence lived on in the flame. Superstitions, too, carried the weight of forgotten divinity. The number 7, revered as sacred, was believed to have been favored by the gods. To see 7 birds in flight was an omen of great change, a sign that the gods were watching. And when someone sneezed, the immediate exclamation of "bless you" wasn't just politeness, it was an instinct, a lingering sense that the unseen forces of the world needed acknowledgement. Persian poetry often captured these whispers of the past, embedding the gods in metaphors so rich that only the most attentive could uncover them. A rose might symbolize Anahita's grace, a raging storm could evoke the might of a long-forgotten war god. The poets didn't just write about love and loss, they painted the remnants of the divine onto the canvas of human emotion, ensuring the god's presence in every stanza. Even as the ancient pantheons faded from official worship, their essence found ways to persist. In times of crisis, when crops failed or illness spread, people instinctively turned to the old ways. They burned incense, not realizing they were recreating rituals meant to honor fire deities. They whispered prayers that had been passed down for generations, their origins obscured but their power undiminished. The gods lived on in dreams, in the collective unconscious of a people who could not fully let them go. They were there in the lullabies sung to restless children, in the charms worn for protection, in the way people greeted the sunrise with a nod of respect. The ancient pantheon, though exiled from temples and texts, found refuge in the human spirit. And perhaps that was their greatest triumph. They didn't need grand monuments or elaborate ceremonies to endure. They had woven themselves into the stories people told, the beliefs they clung to, and the dreams that visited them in the quiet hours of the night. In this way, the gods remained eternal, their whispers as alive as the hearts that still heard them. The first sign was subtle, almost imperceptible, a shimmer in the air, a momentary stillness that made people pause without knowing why. It happened in the midst of an ordinary day, as a farmer bent over his plow or a child chased after a butterfly. The world seemed to hold its breath, as though waiting for something ancient and powerful to awaken. A shepherd in the highlands noticed it first. The stars above him seemed brighter, their light pulsing as if in rhythm with a heartbeat that wasn't his own. The wind, usually brisk and playful, turned heavy with whispers. He could almost make out words in a language he didn't understand, but felt deep in his bones. His sheep, usually restless, stood still, their eyes fixed on the horizon. There, just above the jagged peaks, a golden glow flickered and vanished. Elsewhere, an artist working on a mosaic found her hands moving as if guided by something unseen. Her brushes dipped into colors she didn't remember preparing, creating forms that felt both unfamiliar and achingly familiar. A face began to take shape, stern, with eyes that seemed to pierce through the layers of time. She stepped back, trembling, unable to explain how she knew that this was no ordinary creation. It was an echo, a fragment of something that refused to be forgotten. And then the dreams began. Across the land, people woke in the middle of the night, their skin cold with sweat, their hearts racing. They spoke of golden palaces and roaring flames, of rivers that glowed under a crimson sky. They dreamt of voices, strong, commanding, and full of longing. "We are here," the voices seemed to say, waiting. Some dismissed these visions as figments of imagination, but others knew better. These weren't dreams. They were messages. In the bustling markets of the cities, strange occurrences disrupted the mundane rhythm of life. A merchant, known for his skepticism, dropped a jar of spices when he swore he saw a shadow move across his stall. It wasn't a thief or a bird, but something larger, cloaked in an aura of majesty and sorrow. He felt it watching him, just for a moment, before it disappeared into the crowd. In the temples that had been abandoned for centuries, where vines crept through cracks in the stone and silence reigned, faint sounds began to stir. A priestess, long resigned to praying to gods who no longer answered, heard the unmistakable hum of a lyre echoing through the halls. She followed the sound to the altar, where a small flame flickered to life. It burned without fuel, its glow steady and resolute. The rivers, too, carried signs. Fishermen along the great waterways spoke of silver fish with eyes that shone like polished gems, leaping in patterns that resembled forgotten symbols. The waters, calm for decades, began to churn with an energy that seemed alive. One evening, under a blood-red sunset, an old woman filling her pitcher knelt and wept as the water glowed gold in her hands. People began to speak of these things in hushed voices. They gathered around fires, sharing stories of how the ordinary had turned extraordinary. A young boy recounted how the stars had moved to form a sigil he recognized from an ancient tapestry in his village. A traveler from the far north claimed he had seen a figure standing in a field of ice, its shadow stretching endlessly across the snow. The signs grew stronger. Statues of gods that had long been withered by time began to change. A crack in the face of a warrior god seemed to close, revealing a fierceness that had been dulled by centuries. In another place, a stone carving of a goddess began to emit a faint light, so soft it was almost invisible, but enough to make those who passed by feel a warmth in their hearts. Some feared these changes, believing them to be omens of chaos. Others welcomed them, seeing them as a promise that the world was not as empty as it had seemed. But none could deny that the air itself felt different. It carried a weight, a presence that was impossible to ignore. One night, a storm unlike any other swept through the mountains. It wasn't the kind of storm that brought destruction. It was electric, alive with colors no one had ever seen. People stood outside their homes, their faces turned to the sky as lightning etched strange symbols into the clouds. A single word echoed across the valleys, spoken in a voice so vast it seemed to come from the earth itself. It wasn't a word anyone understood, yet its meaning resonated deeply: return. The culmination came in the heart of an ancient city, where an unassuming boy stumbled into the ruins of an old temple while playing with friends. He tripped over a broken pillar and landed before a carved stone basin. As his blood from a scraped hand dripped into the basin, the air seemed to shatter. Light burst forth, filling every crevice of the ruins. The boy's friends screamed and ran, but he stayed, mesmerized. He swore he saw figures forming in the light, tall, regal, and radiant. They looked down at him with expressions of profound sorrow and hope. The boy returned to his village, his eyes filled with a wisdom far beyond his years. He said nothing of what he'd seen, but he began to hum a tune no one recognized. Strangely, when he hummed, people felt their fears ease, their pains diminish. Everywhere, the signs pointed to one truth. The gods, who had once ruled with power and grace, had never truly left. They had waited, biding their time, watching as the world changed and the hearts of mortals faltered. But now, it seemed, they were stirring. Their voices, once silent, were beginning to call out. And though no one could say for certain what would happen next, one thing was clear: the age of myths was not yet over. The night it began, the sky turned a color no one could name. It wasn't black, nor the deep blue of twilight, but something unnatural, an abyss threaded with veins of crimson and silver, pulsing like the beating of some colossal heart. The wind carried whispers, harsh and guttural, in languages older than the mountains. People stopped in their tracks, clutching their chests, unsure whether it was fear or something more primal taking hold. In the quiet valleys and crowded cities alike, lights flickered and died. Fires refused to burn, candles sputtered out, and even the stars above seemed to dim. The world plunged into an unsettling darkness that felt alive, as though it had crept out from beneath the earth to smother everything in its grasp. Then, the first shadows appeared. It was a farmer who saw them first, standing at the edge of his fields where the forest began. He couldn't describe what he saw later, only that the figures were impossibly tall and cloaked in darkness that seemed to drink in the faint light of the moon. Their eyes, or what passed for eyes, burned with a pale, malevolent glow. The farmer screamed, but the sound was swallowed before it could reach his lips. The figures didn't move, but their presence seeped into him, filling him with dread so deep it felt like his soul was unraveling. By morning, the farmer was gone. Only his shadow remained, burned into the ground as if scorched by an invisible fire. Across the land, stories began to spread. A fisherman in a coastal village vanished after pulling a net filled with writhing, blackened shapes. A merchant traveling the desert spoke of an oasis turned to glass, with no sign of life except the faint echo of laughter that wasn't his own. In the great cities, statues of ancient gods cracked and crumbled, their once proud faces twisted into expressions of agony. The whispers grew louder, no longer carried by the wind, but rising from the very earth. People heard them in their dreams, and when they woke, the voices didn't stop. They spoke of chaos, of worlds undone and remade, of the return of beings older than time itself. The devs, they called them, forces of destruction and disorder, banished in a forgotten age, but never truly defeated. And now, they were returning. In the mountains, entire villages disappeared overnight, leaving behind streets littered with ash and footprints too large to be human. In the deserts, great storms rose without warning, spiraling towers of sand and flame that swallowed caravans whole. Even the seas were not spared. Fishermen spoke of monstrous forms moving beneath the waves, so vast they could only be glimpsed in fragments, a fin here, a glowing eye there. Ships vanished, their wreckage never found. But it wasn't just the land that changed. People did too. A young girl in a temple began to speak in tongues, her voice layered and resonant, like a chorus of the damned. Her eyes turned black, her skin pale as marble, and she uttered prophecies that froze the hearts of all who heard them. "They rise," she said, over and over again. "They rise, and the light will shatter." In another village, a man returned home after being lost in the forest for 3 days. He was unharmed but different. His eyes glowed faintly in the dark, and he moved with a stiffness that made his neighbors uneasy. When questioned, he simply smiled and said, "I saw them. They are beautiful." Fear spread like wildfire. Towns fortified their gates, families huddled together in prayer, and those who could fled to the mountains or the sea, searching for some place untouched by the spreading darkness. But the shadows were everywhere. And then came the fire. It began in the eastern hills, where the night sky was split by a brilliant, searing light. For a moment, it looked as if the sun had risen hours too soon. But the light wasn't warm. It was cold, biting, and it carried with it the faint, metallic scent of blood. From that fire emerged the first of the devs. It stood taller than any man, its body a shifting mass of shadow and flame. Its face, if it had one, was obscured, but its presence was overwhelming, crushing the air and making the earth tremble. Those who saw it spoke of an overwhelming urge to kneel, not out of reverence, but sheer, uncontrollable terror. The dev moved with deliberate, unnatural grace, each step cracking the ground beneath it. It didn't speak, but its presence was a declaration, a promise of destruction and despair. Others followed. From the deserts, the oceans, the forests, they emerged, each one unique but all bearing the same air of malice and power. One resembled a serpent coiled around itself, its scales glinting like molten silver. Another was a towering figure of smoke and ash, its form constantly shifting, as if it couldn't decide what it wanted to be. And then there were those that defied description altogether, their forms so alien that the mind recoiled at the sight of them. Resistance was futile. Armies were crushed beneath invisible forces, their weapons shattering as if made of glass. Temples, once bastions of faith, crumbled at the mere approach of these beings. Even the bravest warriors found themselves paralyzed, unable to lift their swords, as the weight of the dev's presence bore down on them. But amidst the despair, there were whispers of hope. Some spoke of ancient texts, buried in forgotten ruins, that spoke of a time when the devs had been defeated before. Others believed that the gods, though silent, were watching, waiting for the right moment to intervene. And then there were those who turned to the fires themselves, believing that the flames carried not just destruction, but the seeds of rebirth. Yet, as the devs moved across the land, their influence grew, corrupting everything in their path. Crops withered, rivers turned to black sludge, and the air itself seemed to thrum with an energy that felt wrong. Humanity stood on the edge of annihilation, its hope flickering like a candle in a storm. But even in the face of such overwhelming power, there were those who refused to bow. They spoke of the light that still lingered, however faint, and of the strength that could be found in unity. And though the devs loomed larger with each passing day, the fight was far from over. The shadows might consume, but they could never truly extinguish the spark of defiance that burned in the hearts of mortals. It began with a dream, or so they thought. A young man, ordinary in all the ways that matter, lay restless on a narrow cot, the dull hum of the city outside his window blending with the occasional rattle of passing cars. His days were filled with monotony, studying for exams, balancing part-time jobs, enduring the weight of a life that felt perpetually stalled. But that night, sleep did not bring the familiar haze of exhaustion. Instead, it brought something else. A vast field stretched before him, lit not by the sun but by an eerie, golden glow that seemed to emanate from the ground itself. The air crackled, thick with energy, as if the world were holding its breath. He walked forward, drawn by the sound of a voice, soft at first, then rising, filling his ears with a language he didn't recognize but somehow understood. He couldn't see the speaker, only a figure wreathed in flames that did not burn, standing at the edge of the horizon. The voice spoke his name, each syllable echoing like a hammer against stone. "You are chosen," it said, and before he could ask what that meant, the dream shattered into darkness. He woke gasping, drenched in sweat, the words still ringing in his ears. He tried to shake it off, chalking it up to stress or an overactive imagination. But the dream did not fade. It came again the next night, and the night after, growing sharper, more vivid, until he could no longer dismiss it as a trick of his mind. Then the marks appeared. One morning, as he brushed his teeth, he noticed a faint, shimmering line etched across his wrist. It looked like a scar but glowed faintly, pulsing with a rhythm that matched his heartbeat. Panic surged, but when he tried to show others, the mark faded, as if it had never been there. And yet, when he was alone, it returned, brighter, more intricate, like a map of veins drawn in light. Strange things began to happen. Once, as he walked home late at night, the streetlights flickered and died, leaving him in darkness. He felt a presence, heavy, suffocating, watching from just beyond the edge of sight. But when he turned, there was nothing there. Another time, he reached out to stop a falling glass, and it froze mid-air for a fraction of a second before crashing to the ground. He couldn't ignore it any longer. Something was happening, and it was connected to him. The visions grew stronger. He saw glimpses of towering figures clad in armor that glowed like molten gold, their eyes like twin suns. He heard whispers of a battle that had raged for millennia, of gods and creatures older than the stars, locked in an eternal struggle. And always, always, the voice called to him. "You are chosen. The time has come." He tried to resist, to bury himself in the mundane, hoping that by ignoring it, the weight of destiny would pass him by. But the world around him began to change. One evening, while sitting on the rooftop of his apartment building, he saw the clouds part. For a brief moment, the night sky revealed not stars, but shapes, colossal forms moving in the heavens, their outlines shimmering with an ancient, otherworldly light. It was beautiful and terrifying, and it left him trembling. The next day, strangers approached him. An old woman on the subway stared at him with wide, unblinking eyes before clutching his hand and whispering, "It's you. I thought they were just stories." A child in the park pointed at him and said, "You're glowing," though no one else seemed to notice. The final push came when he stumbled upon the figure from his dreams. He was walking home from work, head down, when he felt a pull, like an invisible thread tugging at his chest. Without knowing why, he followed it, weaving through narrow streets and alleys until he reached an abandoned lot. There, standing in the center of the overgrown weeds, was the being he had seen in his visions. It was both blindingly bright and impossibly dark, a paradox of form and light. When it spoke, the ground trembled. "You cannot run from this," it said, its voice filled with both sorrow and authority. "The old ones rise. The dead spread their shadow. And you, mortal, must stand between the light and the abyss." He wanted to refuse, to scream that they had the wrong person, that he was no hero, just a kid barely keeping his life together. But the figure stepped closer, and with it came a wave of warmth that washed over him like a tide. It wasn't comforting, but it wasn't cruel either. It was a promise, a weight that settled deep in his chest. "You carry their mark," it said, gesturing to his wrist, where the glowing lines now blazed like fire. "You are the bridge between what was and what will be." The figure vanished, leaving him alone in the dark. But the weight remained. From that night on, the world felt different. He began to notice things he had missed before, the faint hum of energy in the air, the way shadows moved just a little too quickly, the whispers that seemed to follow him everywhere he went. He didn't know what he was supposed to do, only that he couldn't ignore it anymore. The mark on his wrist was no longer just a symbol, it was a beacon, a call to action he could no longer deny. The weight of it all threatened to crush him, but beneath the fear, a spark began to grow. It was faint, fragile, but it was there, a flicker of courage, of resolve. He didn't understand the full scope of what lay ahead, but for the first time, he felt the stirrings of something greater than himself. And so, he began to walk a path he had never chosen, but that somehow felt inevitable, each step guided by a voice that no longer felt distant, but a part of him. The night was heavy with silence, a kind that pressed against the ears and made the world feel as though it held its breath. In the center of a barren plain, a circle of figures stood cloaked in shadows, their faces hidden by hoods that swayed in the faint breeze. They were strangers to each other, yet bound by a purpose that had drawn them from the farthest corners of the earth. In the middle of the circle, a vast stone altar rose from the earth, jagged and ancient, its surface etched with symbols that pulsed faintly with a golden light. Around it, a scattering of relics glimmered in the moonlight, jewels, feathers, fragments of bone, all offerings to a past that refused to be forgotten. One by one, they raised their hands, their voices trembling as they spoke words that had not been uttered for centuries. The air seemed to ripple with each syllable, as though the very fabric of the world protested their audacity. The leader, a woman with eyes like burning coals, stepped forward. Her hands shook, not from fear but from the sheer weight of what was about to unfold. In her grasp, she held an ancient artifact, a golden chalice, its surface scarred and weathered by time. She lifted it high, and for a moment, the moon seemed to dim, as if the heavens themselves bent to watch. As the chant reached its crescendo, the ground beneath their feet began to tremble. A low, rumbling sound rose from the earth, like the groan of a giant stirring from slumber. The golden light on the altar surged, spreading outward in tendrils that snaked through the air, weaving between the gathered figures like living vines. The woman's voice broke, faltering under the weight of what she saw. The air in the circle thickened, becoming something alive, something aware. A crack split the sky, sharp and jagged, revealing a void of infinite darkness. From it poured a light that was not light at all, but something older, something that carried the scent of forgotten forests and the roar of long-dead oceans. It was the kind of presence that made the heart race and the knees weaken, not from fear, but from the undeniable truth that they stood in the presence of the divine. One figure stepped forward, their hood falling away to reveal a face streaked with tears. They whispered a name, soft and reverent, and the light pulsed in response. Shapes began to form within the brilliance, faint at first, then sharper, more defined. A figure emerged, stepping into the mortal plane with a grace that defied gravity. Their forms shimmered, shifting between human and something more, something vast and unknowable. Their eyes burned with the fire of stars, and their voice, when they spoke, was both thunder and the gentle rustle of leaves. "Who calls us back?" The woman with the chalice dropped to her knees, the artifact clattering to the ground. She tried to speak, but her voice was swallowed by the overwhelming presence of the god before her. Another figure took her place, their voice steady despite the tears streaming down their face. "We call you back," they said, their words firm but laced with awe. "The world needs you. The shadows grow. The devs rise. Without you, we are lost." The god tilted their head, their expression unreadable. Behind them, the crack in the sky widened, and more forms began to descend. One by one, they came, each distinct, each carrying an aura that seemed to shift the very nature of reality. There was the one who wore a cloak of feathers, their face half hidden by a veil of smoke. Another walked barefoot, their steps leaving trails of blooming flowers in the cracked earth. A third carried a blade that glowed with the light of 1,000 sunsets, its edge humming with barely restrained power. Each was a memory made flesh, a story stepping out of the pages of myth and into the fragile reality of the present. The mortals could do nothing but watch, their hearts pounding in their chests, their bodies trembling under the sheer weight of what they had wrought. And yet, for all the power that surrounded them, there was no fear, only a profound, aching awe. The gods stood among them, their presence a symphony of light and shadow, chaos and order. They spoke not with words, but with their very being, their movements and gestures conveying truths too vast for mortal tongues. But not all who watched that night knelt in reverence. From the edges of the circle, unseen eyes observed, filled not with awe, but with envy and rage. The resurgence of the gods was not a gift to all. For some, it was a threat, a reminder of a power that had once oppressed and controlled. The air shifted, heavy with tension, as the gods turned their gaze outward. They knew. They felt it. The shadows at the edge of the light were not merely darkness, but something more, something waiting. And still, the ritual continued. One by one, the gathered mortals stepped forward, offering their relics and speaking the names of gods long forgotten. Each name spoken was like a spark, igniting a memory that burst into being. The gods grew more solid, their forms less ethereal, their presence more anchored to the world they had left behind. As the last offering was placed on the altar, the golden light surged once more, brighter than the sun, and then disappeared, leaving only the faint glow of the god's presence. The leader, still trembling, finally found her voice. "Will you stand with us?" she asked, her words barely more than a whisper. The god with the burning eyes stepped forward, their expression both tender and stern. They reached out, a hand of light and shadow, and placed it on her shoulder. "We have returned," they said, their voice filling the air with an unshakable promise. "But the path ahead is fraught with darkness. It is not only our strength that will decide the fate of this world. It is yours. Will you stand with us?" The woman nodded, tears streaming down her face. She looked around at the others, and though fear lingered in their eyes, something stronger burned within them now, resolve. The gods turned their gaze to the horizon, where the faintest flicker of shadow moved, retreating but not vanquished. For the first time in millennia, the earth held its guardians once more. But the battle had only just begun. The sky cracked open like the first rift of a storm, lightning slicing through the night with a brilliance that felt like the world itself was being torn apart. Below, the earth shuddered in anticipation, and in the distance, dark shapes gathered, growing ever closer with each passing heartbeat. The gods, now fully returned, stood at the edge of the battleground, their forms glowing with an ethereal light, but their eyes, those eyes, were full of something much older, something darker. In the opposite direction, the dev stirred. Shadows that had long been hidden beneath the earth's crust, beneath the depths of forgotten memories, began to rise. The ancient ones, creatures of chaos, of destruction, stretched and breathed life back into their broken forms. The ground buckled beneath them as they poured into the open, their eyes burning with hatred, their whispers more dangerous than any storm. The prophecy had spoken of this moment, and now it was here. The clash of the eternal forces, the divine and the demonic, the light and the dark, would once again ignite a war that would reshape everything. A breath hung heavy in the air, caught between the past and the present, between what was foretold and what was about to unfold. The stars seemed to dim as though they, too, felt the weight of the coming storm. In the midst of the gathering, the woman, the one who had called the gods back, stood still, her heart racing. Her body trembled not from fear, but from the responsibility that now rested upon her. She knew the stories, the ancient words passed down through the ages. She had heard them all her life. But to stand on the precipice of the battle, knowing what was at stake, was a different thing altogether. Behind her, the gods began to move, their feet silent on the earth, but their presence loud in the very air. The god who had first emerged, with eyes like burning coals, lifted their hands to the sky. The ground at their feet cracked, and from the depths of the earth, massive wings of fire erupted, setting the horizon ablaze with their power. With a voice that vibrated through the marrow of every living thing, the god called out to the others. The air thickened with their responses. The earth trembled beneath the weight of their combined strength. And then, they came. The devs, dark as night and cold as death, poured forth from the shadows. Their eyes gleamed like liquid fire, and their massive forms shifted in unnatural ways, bending and contorting like living nightmares. Their skin was blackened stone, cracked and weathered by millennia of waiting. The ground beneath their feet shattered, as if the earth itself refused to bear their weight. The gods stood tall, their forms radiant with an unearthly glow. The first of them raised their hand, and the heavens answered. Thunder rumbled as bolts of lightning arced down, striking the earth, splitting it open like a wound. And yet, the devs advanced, undeterred, their own voices rising in a chorus of madness, filled with hatred for the gods who had once ruled them. The battle began. With a roar, the first of the devs lunged forward, its enormous claws slashing through the air, aimed at the nearest god. But the god, its skin glowing with light, was faster. With a swift movement, it struck, sending the dev sprawling into the earth with a sound like thunder. The ground split beneath its weight as it struggled to rise, the air heavy with the clash of power. Another god stepped forward, this one cloaked in a swirling cloak of smoke. Their form flickered between the material world and the ethereal, dodging the strikes of the devs as if they were nothing but shadows themselves. The devs, relentless and furious, charged, their roars filling the night. But then came the god with the sword, its blade glowing with the brilliance of 1,000 suns. With a single motion, the blade cut through the air, a line of light following its wake. One of the devs lunged at the god, but the sword met its flesh with the sound of steel tearing through stone. The dev screamed, the howl of its agony echoing across the battlefield, but the gods did not falter. They continued their fight, a storm of light and shadow, chaos and order. On the ground, mortals fought alongside the gods, their weapons small and fragile compared to the powers surrounding them. But they fought with everything they had, for they knew the stakes. The gods had returned, but their victory was not certain. The shadows would not go easily into the night. The devs, dark and ancient, fought with a ferocity born of ages in exile. And then, in the heart of the battle, something shifted. A crack appeared in the sky, wider than before, and through it, something new emerged, a shape, something that had not been seen for millennia. Its form was cloaked in darkness, but beneath the shadows, eyes like molten gold burned. It spoke not with words, but with power, its very presence breaking the air around it. The air grew colder, and the light of the gods dimmed. The god who had called the heavens to strike with lightning turned to face this new foe, and their voice, once full of fire, now faltered. The devs had not only returned, they had brought something with them. Something ancient, something that would turn the tide of the battle. And just as the sky opened wide with the dark figure's arrival, the ground trembled beneath them. The earth seemed to crack and crumble, as if the land itself was alive, caught between two forces, each claiming it for their own. The gods' light flickered, and for a moment, it seemed that they might be overwhelmed, their power slowly being smothered by the devs' chaos. But even as the gods fought with all their might, their power waning in the face of the ancient evil that had once been their equal, a faint whisper rose in the wind. The woman, the one who had called them back, closed her eyes, feeling it in her soul. The prophecy had spoken of this moment, the return of the devs, the clash of gods and monsters. But it had also spoken of the chosen, the one who would stand at the center of it all, holding the balance between light and darkness. And now, she understood. This battle, this war between gods and devs, was not just about power. It was about rebirth. It was about the return of an age-old struggle that could either renew the world or destroy it. As the gods clashed with the devs, the woman stepped forward, her heart racing with the weight of destiny. She understood, now, that the prophecy was not about them, the gods or the devs. It was about her. She held her breath and raised her hands to the sky. The prophecy had already begun. The war had already been ignited. And there was no turning back. The ground beneath their feet trembled. At first, it was a subtle vibration, barely noticed, like the hum of a far-off train. But soon, the earth shook violently, as if something ancient, something buried for centuries, had awakened. The sky, darkened by the chaos of the celestial war, began to crack open in jagged lines, revealing glimpses of something not of this world, a doorway, an entrance to a place long lost to the memories of mankind. In the chaos of the battle, where gods clashed with the devs and the earth seemed to collapse under the weight of ancient forces, humanity had no choice but to flee. The cities burned, the earth split, and the skies were filled with the roar of thunder and the screams of those caught in the middle. Yet, in the midst of it all, a whisper echoed through the hearts of the survivors, a whisper carried by the wind, murmured in every language, calling them to the depths. The door had opened. Beneath the surface of the earth, where once there had been only darkness, a world hidden from human eyes for centuries stirred. It was a place that had existed in myth and legend, a refuge for the survivors of a time when the gods themselves walked the earth. It was Yima's Vara, the underground sanctuary promised to humanity when the world above became too violent to endure. The first to see it were the elders, those who still held the stories of old in their hearts, those who had lived through the first whispers of the gods' return. They knew what it was, the Vara. They had heard of it in childhood tales, and whispers shared by their ancestors, tales told around fires, stories passed down through generations. And so, when the ground split open, revealing a pathway that led deep beneath the earth, they understood. The Vara had returned. In the streets above, the panic was palpable. People scrambled, desperate, lost in a world suddenly unfamiliar, where the heavens themselves were torn apart. But then, like a lifeline cast into the storm, the elders spoke with quiet urgency. They moved quickly, gathering those they could find, families, strangers, neighbors, and leading them to the entrance that had appeared in the earth. As they descended into the darkness, the air grew cooler, the noise of the surface world muffled behind them. The pathway was narrow at first, rough-hewn, as if the earth itself had been split open to make room for their passage. But with each step, it widened, and the deeper they went, the more the light from the surface faded, replaced by a strange, otherworldly glow that seemed to emanate from the walls themselves. The deeper they went, the more the whispers of the old stories seemed to echo around them. The Vara was not just a place of refuge. It was a sanctuary built by the gods themselves for a time like this. A time when the heavens would burn, when humanity would be forced to retreat from the fury above. It had been a promise, a pact made long ago, and now it was their salvation. As they descended, the air grew richer, thicker, filled with an energy that made their skin tingle. It was as though they had entered a different world altogether, a world where time moved differently, where the rules that governed the surface above had no power. The walls shimmered with light, casting strange, luminous patterns on the stone. The further they ventured, the more the world around them felt like something ancient and alive, a place that had waited patiently for their return. At the heart of this underground world, they found it, a great cavern, its ceiling high and its walls covered in intricate carvings and symbols. The space was vast, more expansive than any human structure could have ever been. The air here was warm, and the ground beneath them felt solid, as though the very earth was alive and breathing. It was in this cavern, at the center of it all, that they found the heart of the Vara, the ancient city, now long forgotten by the surface world. Towers made of stone, unlike any human architecture, rose from the ground. Each one was covered in vines and roots, their surfaces glistening with a strange, unearthly sheen. Water cascaded from the edges of the stones, creating crystal-clear streams that ran through the city, pooling in intricate patterns. The sound of rushing water was soothing, a stark contrast to the violent chaos left behind on the surface. The survivors were led through the city, their eyes wide with awe and disbelief. This was no ordinary place. It was a city built by gods, a city untouched by the turmoil above. In the distance, they could see a great central temple, its doors wide open as if awaiting their arrival. It was here that they would find their refuge, but it was also here that the weight of their survival would truly begin to settle in. As they gathered in the great hall of the temple, the survivors could feel the power of the place all around them. It was as if the Vara had been waiting for them all this time, waiting for the right moment to open its doors. The gods had promised this place, and now, as the world above burned, humanity had come to claim it. But even as they took refuge in the Vara, there was a quiet understanding among them, a knowledge that their lives, their world, had changed forever. They had escaped the chaos, yes, but at what cost? What had happened to the world they had once known? What had happened to the gods who had promised them protection? And somewhere, in the deepest part of their hearts, the survivors knew that this underground world, for all its safety and beauty, was not truly a sanctuary. It was merely a pause in a much larger, much darker story. The gods had returned, and the devs had risen. The battle was far from over. As they sat in the great hall, the whispers of the gods filled the air, soft and distant, like echoes from another time. The light of their torches flickered in the corners of the room, casting long shadows against the walls. The survivors, their hearts heavy with the knowledge of the fate they had narrowly escaped, could only wait. The gods had promised them refuge. But for how long? And would they still be there when the battle on the surface reached its boiling point? In the silence of the Vara, as the shadows grew longer and the light dimmed, one thing was clear: humanity had found its place in the world of the gods. But that world was changing, and the survivors would have to decide where they truly belonged. The sky above was a riot of red and gold, the sun burning its way toward the horizon, caught in the endless struggle between light and darkness. The earth beneath trembled, echoing the shifting balance of the cosmos. The gods had awoken, the earth had cracked, and a storm of chaos had unleashed itself upon the world. And through it all, one figure rose with clarity and strength, a figure whose presence alone seemed to command the very air around him. Mitra, the god of truth, stood at the forefront of the celestial charge, his eyes burning with a fierce, unwavering resolve. The battle was far from over, but Mitra knew what had to be done. The world teetered on the edge of destruction, its foundations shaking with the clash of gods and devs, each side vying for supremacy. The cosmic order was in jeopardy, and only one force could restore it, the unyielding force of truth. He had seen the world descend into lies and deceit. He had watched as the powers of darkness sought to twist and manipulate, pulling the very fabric of existence into their corrupted grasp. But Mitra knew that truth, no matter how hidden or buried, was a weapon more powerful than any force of darkness. It could cut through the lies like a blade, restore order to the chaos, and bring balance back to a broken world. Mitra's hand clenched around his sword, a weapon forged from the very essence of truth itself. Its blade shimmered with an ethereal light, the reflection of 1,000 truths locked within it. He turned toward his followers, those who had rallied to his cause, drawn by his unwavering conviction and the promise of restoration. They were ready, their hearts burning with the same fire that lit Mitra's soul. They knew that the path ahead would not be easy, that the cost would be high, but they also knew that the only way forward was through the light of truth. As Mitra led them toward the battlefield, his presence seemed to quiet the storm around them. The air grew still, heavy with the anticipation of the battle to come. His voice, calm and steady, rang out over the ranks of his followers. "Do not falter," he said, his words carrying the weight of the ages. "The darkness is strong, but it is nothing compared to the power of truth. We are the light that will pierce the shadows. We are the force that will restore balance." With that, He stepped forward, his feet moving with purpose, each step a declaration of his unwavering belief. The armies of gods and devs clashed around him, their battles fought with all the fury of ancient hatred. Yet, Mitra remained calm, his focus unwavering. He was not here to fight with strength alone, he was here to bring truth to the battlefield, to restore the balance that had been lost. The first blow struck. A dev, a creature of darkness, lunged at Mitra, its claws slashing through the air. But Mitra was faster. With a swift motion, he raised his sword, and the dev's strike was deflected. The creature howled in fury, but Mitra did not flinch. He did not need to. Truth had already won the battle. He swung his sword, and the blade glowed brighter, shining with the pure light of clarity. The dev was thrown back, its form flickering like a fading shadow as the light of Mitra's sword cut through it. With each strike, the air seemed to grow cleaner, the oppressive weight of darkness lifting. His followers fought with renewed strength, their spirits lifted by the sheer power of the god's presence. Mitra moved through the battlefield like a force of nature, his step steady, his strike swift and sure. He was not fighting for victory alone, he was fighting for something far greater. He was fighting for the truth that had been buried beneath layers of corruption, for the restoration of a world that had been twisted by lies and deceit. With every blow, he shattered the illusions that had held the world in thrall. And as he pressed forward, something miraculous began to happen. The gods who had once stood on the sidelines, watching the chaos unfold, began to rally behind him. They saw the truth in Mitra's actions, the power of his unwavering belief, the purity of his intent. One by one, they joined his cause, their hands raised in solidarity, their hearts ignited by the power of the truth they had long forgotten. Together, they formed a wall of light, pushing back the darkness, restoring balance to the world. The battle raged on, but with Mitra leading the charge, the tide had turned. The devs, once a force of overwhelming power, began to falter, their shadows receding before the light of truth. They had no answer to it. They could twist, they could deceive, but they could not stand against the unyielding force of truth. And in that moment, as the forces of darkness began to retreat, Mitra's gaze turned upward, his eyes catching the dying rays of the sun as it sank beneath the horizon. The sky was no longer a battlefield, it was a symbol of what had been restored. The cosmic order had been brought back into balance. The forces of truth had triumphed. But Mitra knew that this victory was not the end. It was only the beginning. The forces of darkness would return. The lies would resurface. The battle would continue. But for now, there was peace. There was balance. And in that moment, Mitra allowed himself a rare, fleeting smile. He had done it. He had restored the balance of the cosmos. His sword, still glowing with the power of truth, lowered slightly as he turned to his followers. They were bruised, battered, but their spirits were high. They had stood with Mitra, and together, they had reclaimed the light. Mitra knew that this was only the first of many battles. The struggle between light and darkness would never cease. But now, they had something to hold onto, a beacon of hope, a reminder that the truth would always prevail. As the dust settled, and the echoes of battle faded into the distance, Mitra stood tall, his heart beating with the knowledge that the balance had been restored, even if only for a time. The gods of truth had led the charge. And with them, the world had found its way back to the light. The world was dark. The remnants of battle lay scattered across the land, and the air, thick with dust, carried the scent of scorched earth. Hope seemed like a fading memory, clinging to the edges of existence, threatening to disappear forever. The gods had risen, and with them came chaos, destruction, and fear. Yet, in the midst of the overwhelming darkness, a flicker of light began to stir, silent but undeniable. A child was born. At first, no one noticed. The birth was quiet, like the first drop of rain before a storm, barely stirring the winds. But as days turned into weeks, and weeks into months, people began to sense something different about the child. Eyes brighter than the morning sun, a presence that seemed to reach beyond the ordinary. It wasn't just the child's beauty or the strength that flowed from every movement, it was something deeper, something ancient, something that had been waiting for a time such as this. The time when the world needed to be saved. This child was Saoshyant. The name itself carried the weight of centuries, a promise embedded in the very fabric of the universe. It had been foretold, the Savior, the one who would restore balance, heal the wounds, and bring an age of enlightenment and unity. No one had known how or when this figure would appear, but now they saw the truth. The Savior had come, not as a conqueror, not as a warrior draped in gold or adorned with weapons. No, Saoshyant was something different. This was a child of peace, a soul of pure purpose, born to end the struggle that had torn the world apart. The heavens had been watching. The gods, the ones who had long since retreated into the shadows, whispered amongst themselves. This child, this Saoshyant, was the embodiment of everything they had hoped for. It was said that the Savior would unite the warring forces, heal the broken, and restore the ancient truths that had been lost in the noise of conflict. And when the time came for the child to take their first steps, the world would tremble, for Saoshyant's footsteps would shake the foundations of the earth, reverberating across time and space. Saoshyant grew quietly, unassuming, but with each passing day, the world around them began to change. Those who were lost, who wandered in darkness, came to the child. They saw something in Saoshyant's eyes, a promise of a future where pain no longer ruled, where bitterness could be replaced with compassion, where the gods no longer fought for supremacy but worked together for the good of all. And slowly, the world began to listen. Leaders who once fought to protect their own power began to seek guidance. Kingdoms that had been divided for generations found themselves opening their gates, sharing what little they had. Even the whispers of war began to quiet as Saoshyant's presence filled the air like a gentle breeze. The child had become a symbol of hope, an incarnation of something greater than any individual, something that transcended belief, culture, and fear. But Saoshyant was not just a symbol. They were the vessel through which change would come. With each word spoken, they spoke of unity, of healing, of forgiveness. They did not seek revenge, nor did they demand loyalty. Instead, Saoshyant simply asked people to look within themselves, to see the world as it truly was, and to strive for something more. With every teaching, the world became brighter, little by little, until one could almost taste the sweetness of a new beginning. The people of the world, once fragmented, began to see each other not as enemies, but as kin. They began to understand the weight of their shared history, the mistakes that had been made, and the path they had walked together. Through Saoshyant's wisdom, they learned that the world could not heal without the collective effort of every person, every race, every belief. In the midst of this growing unity, the gods watched with quiet pride. Saoshyant's light, brighter than any of them had imagined, had begun to illuminate the darkest corners of existence. The ancient forces of chaos, the Devs, were pushed further back, their hold on the world weakening as humanity found its strength in each other, united under the banner of the Savior. But Saoshyant knew that true peace would not come overnight. The shadows still lurked, waiting for the right moment to strike. The battle was not over, it had only just begun. Saoshyant's task was not to bring immediate peace, but to set the stage for a future where humanity could stand together, unafraid of the darkness, unbowed by the forces that sought to divide them. One night, as Saoshyant stood beneath the stars, gazing at the world they had started to heal, they felt the weight of everything that was to come. The responsibility was enormous, the burden heavy. But within their heart, there was a quiet assurance, a certainty that this was their path, their destiny. The path would not be easy, but the world needed to know that it was possible to rebuild. And in that moment, something extraordinary happened. The earth beneath them seemed to hum, a low, resonant vibration, as though the world itself was alive and listening. The sky above shifted, the stars twinkling with an intensity that had not been seen in generations. The gods themselves seemed to gather, watching as Saoshyant stood tall, a beacon of hope in a darkened world. It was a sign. The dawn had arrived. The age of enlightenment had begun. Saoshyant turned away from the heavens, their eyes shining with the light of 1,000 truths. They had come to guide, to lead, but also to remind humanity of something forgotten, the power of unity, the strength found in forgiveness, the peace that comes from understanding. And though the journey ahead would be long, and the road difficult, Saoshyant knew that the seeds of change had been planted. Now, it was up to the world to tend to them. The light that had been sparked within Saoshyant's heart would now ignite the hearts of many, and together, they would rebuild a world where love, truth, and unity reigned over all. It was a dawn like no other, and it had only just begun. The air was heavy with anticipation, a stillness that seemed to stretch on forever, as if the world itself was holding its breath. Below, the land was quiet. The fires that had once burned in fury were now embers, flickering weakly in the distance. The echoes of the battle had faded, but the tension remained, thick and suffocating. Above, the sky, which had once burned with the ferocity of 1,000 storms, was now painted in soft shades of dusk, a quiet promise, as though the universe itself was waiting for something that would shape the future. At the heart of it all stood a circle, a space where gods and mortals met, not as enemies, not as strangers, but as something new, something never before seen, a united force, standing side by side. The gods had once walked among mortals, their power unmatched, their will law. But time had passed, and the world had changed. What was once clear and unquestionable had become fragmented, broken. The world was on the brink of collapse, teetering between the forces of destruction and the light of hope. And now, after centuries of struggle, after a war that had ravaged everything, something had to give. There was no more room for division, no more time for pride. The gods had seen it. Mortals had felt it. And now, in this fragile moment of peace, a new agreement had to be forged. Mitra, the god of truth, stood at the front of the circle, his presence a steadying force, his eyes filled with the wisdom of ages. Behind him, the gods who had fought alongside him now stood in unity. Beside them were the mortals, a tapestry of faces, each one marked by loss, yet also by an unwavering resolve. They were here, not as subjects, not as followers, but as equals, bound together by a common need, a need to rebuild, to restore, and to ensure that such destruction never came again. Mitra's voice rang out, clear and unwavering, as he spoke the words that would seal their fate. "We have fought," he said, "and we have lost. But in our losses, we have found something greater than ourselves. We have found unity. We have found the strength that comes from standing together, not as gods and mortals, but as one." The silence that followed his words was deep, not uncomfortable, but solemn. It was the weight of history, of knowledge passed down from one generation to the next. The gods, once rulers over all, had seen their fall. The mortals, once powerless before them, had seen their own rise. Now, they stood together, a delicate balance, each side offering something the other had long forgotten: humility, strength, wisdom, and the recognition that neither side could survive without the other. A great hand, massive and divine, extended into the circle, the hand of the god of the sea, a being whose power was legendary. With a single motion, he placed his palm against the earth, and from that touch, cracks began to form, rivers, mountains, cities, all were reborn from his touch. And then, his voice broke through the stillness. "This world is a fragile thing," the god of the sea murmured, "and it is only through understanding that we will ensure its survival." The words hung in the air, and a quiet ripple spread through the circle. Mortals, once afraid to speak in the presence of such power, now stood tall. They had known fear, pain, and loss, but they had also known resilience. They had learned that survival wasn't about strength alone, it was about connection. It was about standing together, holding each other up when everything else crumbled. A mortal stepped forward. His face, though weathered by time, glowed with a fierce determination. He looked up at the gods, and his voice was steady as he spoke. "We, too, have learned. We have learned that power without compassion leads only to destruction. We have felt the weight of the world upon our shoulders, but we have also carried it, together." The gods looked upon him, their eyes filled with both sorrow and respect. They had once ruled with an iron fist, shaping the world with their will. But they had seen the consequences of that power. The gods had watched as their creations had suffered, as their own hubris had brought ruin to the world they had sworn to protect. The god of the sun, his form glowing with the warmth of 1,000 stars, spoke next. His voice was both gentle and fierce. "We have cast shadows upon this world, and now we must light the way." He turned to the mortals standing at his side. "Your hearts burn with the same fire that ignites the stars. You are not weak. You are the ones who will carry the flame forward when we are gone." And so it began, the pact, the covenant. A promise, made not in words alone, but in actions. The gods would no longer rule with fear and force. They would guide, protect, and nurture. The mortals would no longer be subjects to be ruled, they would be partners, collaborators in the future of the world. There would be no more division, no more struggle for dominance. The gods and mortals would walk the same path, side by side, each offering their strengths, each learning from the other. The gods placed their hands upon the earth, their power flowing into the ground, into the roots of trees, into the hearts of mortals. The earth trembled, but it was not with fear. It was with the force of creation, the promise of life. And as the gods sealed their covenant with the land, a light shone from within them, a light that was not their own, but that of the world they had created. The air began to shift. The darkness that had once threatened to engulf everything began to recede. The winds, once howling with rage, now blew gently, like the breath of a mother soothing her child. The stars above twinkled brighter, and for the first time in a long while, the earth felt still, at peace. Mitra, standing at the center of the circle, raised his sword, its blade no longer a weapon of war, but a symbol of unity. The gods, standing tall, their faces softened by wisdom, joined him. And the mortals, those who had stood beside them, their hearts and hands intertwined with the gods, stood together, their voices rising as one. This was the final pact, the agreement that would bind them all to the future. It was not a promise made out of fear, nor was it one born from weakness. It was a vow born from understanding, the understanding that only together, as one, could they truly restore balance, heal the wounds of the past, and build a world where peace and harmony could endure. And as the last words of the pact were spoken, a brilliant light shone, and for the first time in what felt like an eternity, the world was whole again. The world was still, as if it too had become aware of the weight of history shifting, settling in place once more. It was a morning like no other, quiet, reverent, where the sun's first light touched the earth with the gentleness of a long-lost friend. Birds sang, but their melodies were different now, carrying a sense of purpose in the air. A weight had been lifted, yet the echo of what had once been, the fury of gods and mortals, the loss, the pain, lingered beneath the surface. It was an echo that would never fully fade, but it wasn't a cry of despair anymore. It was something else, something more powerful, a whisper of understanding, of shared wisdom. In the distance, the ruins of what had once been a city now seemed to glow softly, bathed in the light of a new dawn. The pillars, long since crumbled, now rose again in a different form, rebuilt in the hearts and minds of the people. The gods who had once ruled with the harshness of a tempest now stood quietly in the background of human lives, no longer in the forefront, but ever present. They watched, not with judgment, but with hope, hope that their return, their resurgence, could be more than just a chapter in the story of the world. It could be the turning of a page to a new future, one where ancient faith and modern humanity could coexist. It was impossible not to feel the weight of what had happened. The earth seemed to hum with the energy of that final pact, a pledge made in the heat of battle but cemented in peace. In the homes of mortals, new altars had been built, not of stone but of the heart. The gods' names, once whispered in fear, now spoken with reverence, hung in the air like incense, a reminder of the old ways. They were not forgotten, they were honored in ways that felt true, not forced. The rituals that had been passed down in fragments were now practiced with a new kind of clarity, a clarity born not from the fear of retribution but from the desire to remember, to understand. Yet, there was something else in the air, something more than just the revival of ancient practices. There was a quiet realization that humanity had changed, too. Mortals, once powerless in the face of divine wrath, had stood shoulder to shoulder with the gods in their time of need. It was a shared experience, one that had forever altered the nature of their relationship. The gods had learned humility, and humanity had learned strength. There was a balance now, a respect between them that had never existed before. They were no longer separate, they were united in the most profound sense. The gods had shown mortals what it meant to be more than just human, and in return, mortals had shown the gods what it meant to be more than just divine. People spoke now of the gods not in fear, but in the same way they spoke of ancestors, of those who came before and shaped the world. The gods had returned, but it wasn't in the way that had been expected. There had been no cataclysm, no fire from the sky. Instead, they had woven themselves into the very fabric of the world, slipping into the cracks of human hearts, inspiring and guiding, without the need for constant displays of power. They had been reborn in the quiet spaces, in the moments of shared humanity, in the acts of kindness and sacrifice. Still, the implications of their return were not lost on anyone. There were those who feared that the old ways, once forgotten, might rise again in darker forms. The gods had shown their wrath before, their anger capable of sweeping away entire civilizations in a single breath. There were whispers, murmurs in the streets, quiet doubts that this fragile peace could be shattered. And yet, even in these moments of uncertainty, there was something different. The fear wasn't as sharp as it once was. It was tempered by the understanding that this time, things had changed. The gods and mortals were no longer two sides of the same coin. They had become one, forever bound by the events that had transpired. It was not just the gods who had changed. Humanity, too, had been remade in the fire of their return. Those who had once been lost in despair, in hopelessness, and the endless struggle of survival, now stood taller, their hearts lighter. They had seen what could happen when the world fell apart, when the line between the divine and the mortal was blurred, and they had learned. They had learned the cost of power and the value of humility. They had learned the cost of violence and the worth of peace. And perhaps most importantly, they had learned that it was never too late to rebuild, to restore, to start anew. In the quiet corners of the world, in the hearts of individuals, the gods' legacy lived on. Not in the grand gestures or the loud proclamations, but in the everyday acts of kindness, in the quiet moments of reflection, and the shared understanding that life, fragile, fleeting, and beautiful, was a gift. It was a lesson the gods had taught through their own suffering, their own rebirth. And it was a lesson humanity had taken to heart. The old gods were not gone. They were not even distant. They were here, now, not as rulers but as companions. They had been reborn not in fire and fury, but in the quiet moments that followed. And as the world turned, as the days became years and the years turned to generations, the memory of that final pact, the promise made between gods and mortals, was woven into the very soul of humanity. It was not just the gods who had been restored. It was humanity's faith, too, a faith that had been shaken to its core, but never broken. And now, that faith burned brighter than it ever had before. It burned with the light of understanding, of shared responsibility, of hope for the future. And though the world had changed, there was one thing that remained the same. The gods, though silent now, still watched over the world. Their presence, no longer imposing, was felt in the spaces between breaths, in the moments of stillness, and the quiet strength of those who walked the earth. They were there, not as rulers, but as guides, reminding all who would listen that the greatest strength is not in domination, but in unity.